I want to welcome everybody to this year's Lessons from the Field series. This year, we're going in a new direction. Our series for the year will be on race, culture, and children's mental health, and we're really glad that you can all be here with us. I'm Joel Hetler, the Director for the Center for Excellence in Children's Mental Health, and your host for the day. The Center for Excellence is part of the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium here at the University of Minnesota, and our mission is to connect research and practice. And so our theme this year is about research and practice in the area of culture and children's mental health. I'm pleased that so many of you are here, and in our viewing audience, there's about 350 people on site at the university here, and another 500 of you in sites all around the state. I believe we have about 30 host sites this year, and so welcome to all of you. You will, just a couple of housekeeping things. Everybody should have a folder, and in your folder there should be a schedule, a bio for each of the presenters, PowerPoint handouts for the presenters. They're not going to be 100% exactly what the presenters are going to show, but close enough. And a flyer for the rest of the series across the year, and evaluation forms. In the metro area, please be sure to fill out your form before you leave today. We really do pay attention to what those evaluations say. And for the folks in the rest of the state, please follow the link in your schedule to do the online form. We really appreciate your feedback. And certificates of attendance will be available to you as you leave. This is the first presentation in our series this year, and we'll have 3 more presentations. The next one in February is going to be about immigrant and refugee mental health. In March, we have a series on the African American experience in child welfare, and in May we have a new partnership that will extend our series. We are partnering with Harris Forum, and we'll be presenting Alicia Lieberman, who will be talking about trauma, early attachment, and culture, and that will be broadcast to the rest of the state. That will be first for us in the new partnership. That said, I think I'm done with most of the housekeeping events. One important one, those of you in the audience, please make sure that your cell phones are turned off or on vibrate, and coordinators in the host sites, please be sure that your microphones are on mute and that they stay that way through the presentation. That said, I think I'm ready to introduce our much-awaited first speaker, Karina Walters. Let me just give you a brief bio on Karina. Just as a personal note, today's the first day that I actually met Karina, but people have been telling me for several years what an outstanding and dynamic speaker she is, and I'm really excited and delighted to have her as our kickoff for this year's series. She's laughing. Hopefully I'm not setting the bar too high for you, but Karina is the William P. and Ruth Derderbring Endowed Professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Washington. She's an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. She has founded and directs the university-wide interdisciplinary Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington. She's a recent recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Award, and her research focuses on historical, social, and cultural determinants of physical and mental health among American Indians and Alaska Natives. She serves as a principal investigator on several groundbreaking studies associated with health risk outcomes among American Indian individuals, families, and communities funded by the National Institute of Health. I would like to introduce Karina.
Good morning. Halito Sahachifa Karina Walters, Micha Chata Sioke. I'm really honored to be here, and after that introduction, I wasn't nervous, but now I am. I wanted to first pay my respects to the indigenous peoples of these territories, the Dakota and the Anishinaabe peoples, and say thank you for allowing me to be here and to speak. I also would like to pay my respects to any elders or other indigenous leaders who've come in to see this today, so thank you. Also wanted to pay my respect to Dr. John Redhorse, who's here. John is the one, when I was a master's student at UCLA many moons ago, who encouraged me and actually told me I should go and apply for my PhD, and I did. And I wouldn't have done that had John not asked me and encouraged me to do that. So it's a real honor to be here today and to be on the stage with John later. So John, I've probably embarrassed you, but thank you. My background actually originally is in child mental health, even though I'm an academic now and a researcher doing work in Indian country. I originally started as a mental health therapist working with children and families. And so today I'm excited to share some of the research that we're doing on American Indian and Alaska Native health issues, especially around historical trauma and microaggressions. Although the research I'm specifically going to be sharing is on adult populations, I'm going to also make that link to children and families and clinical interventions as well, primarily for the second half of the presentation. So for those of you who are kind of waiting for that, that will be in the presentation. I also wanted to acknowledge where I come from. I introduced myself in Choctaw, and I'm originally I'm Oklahoma Choctaw by descent through my mom, and I'm enrolled in my tribe. I was born and raised in Hollywood, California, so I get to say that I'm a real Hollywood Indian. So, but I always like to, for those of you who are unfamiliar with my tribe, I always like to show some pictures of some of our gatherings, and that's our chief in the middle there. And I know a number of you are probably familiar already with a lot of American Indian issues, but I also just wanted to kind of highlight, that there's several million American Indians, Alaska Natives in this country, and I'm going to talk a little bit, introduce you to some of the indigenous health issues that we're facing before I get to historical trauma. I think to understand our health, you have to understand our health from a historical trauma, or what we call a fourth world perspective. Otherwise, we run the risk of really pathologizing our communities if we don't contextualize the data closely. And that's what's moved me into the historical trauma discrimination kind of framework to look at our health. And our health is similar around the world. So it's not surprising to find out that indigenous health, there's a pervasive pattern of health disparities, an unequal burden of chronic illnesses, disproportionate levels of mortality and morbidity for behavioral health conditions like cardiovascular disease, HIV, and we have escalating rates of chronic disease, respiratory and reproductive health problems. All of these are global. So it's not unique just to American Indian and Alaska Native populations, but we see similar patterns around the world with our indigenous populations. To contextualize those kinds of health disparities, they're also tied to disproportionate exposure to structural inequalities, environmental toxins, high levels of poverty and socioeconomic deprivation, exposure to chronic and persistent discrimination, which we'll be highlighting today, and poor access to healthcare services. So there's a remarkable similar legacy of health disparities and health conditions under which these disparities occur across the globe. And this is linked primarily to colonialism, and so that's going to be something I'll talk about today as well. The data I'm going to be sharing with you is primarily urban samples, and now nearly almost 3/4 of our population, at least 2/3 now live in urban environments. And a lot of people don't realize that urban, even though we're living in the cities, there's a lot of assumptions then we must be getting better resources and we must be better off. But actually, in terms of health disparities and health problems, we actually have higher rates in some cases than our reservation and rural brothers and sisters, in part because we don't have access to Indian health services. So people wait till they get really sick before they drive the 10 hours or 12 hours to go home to get any kind of services. So about 1 out of 3 Native people have absolutely no health care, especially in urban settings. So what we see is really high rates of infant mortality and other kinds of things that are higher in urban settings than you would anticipate. So the economic vulnerability and in ill health in our urban settings, of course, make us more vulnerable to kind of chronic health conditions and issues. Now, a lot of people say, well, the problem is it's because we live in the cities. So it's city living that's causing this stress. But I want to challenge that a little bit because we've lived in cities before. Okay. This is Cahokia. I don't know if how many of you are familiar with Cahokia? Have you had a chance to ever go there? If you do, I really encourage you. Cahokia is an ancient city, almost 2,000 years old, about 1,800, 1,500 years old, an ancient city just outside of St. Louis. And the base of the pyramid there, or the base mound rather, is bigger than any of the pyramids in Egypt. So it was an incredible city. And at its height, it housed about 40,000, the estimates range between 25 to 40,000 indigenous people. So it's not that we haven't been urban before and we haven't had city living, but what's different now is having to be in urban conditions under colonialism and imperialism. So that's what's different about it. It's not on our terms. And so I want to highlight that because I think a lot of the times we jump to kind of these assumptions, well, it's because we're in the city, or we're because, well, again, we have to go back to that context, and quite often it's dealing with colonization. So it's important that we really consider this fourth world perspective, because if we don't, it can lead to an unintentional pathologization of our communities. And many of our behavioral health problems that we see are actually directly connected to having an oppressed or colonized status in this country. And so I'll share with you some of the data that supports that. To help us understand the data and the pathways to these health disparities, we at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, we've been developing a model that we call the Indigenous Stress Coping Model. And it's based on stress coping theories that are out there, but basically, it delineates the pathways between social experiences, social, historical, and cultural determinants of health outcomes. And part of the model is looking at how does trauma and discrimination and chronic stress literally become embodied in the body and become embodied in family patterns and communications and become embodied in risk behaviors. So that's going to be the trail we're going on today. And to illustrate the model, I'm going to do it with pictures. I'm going to be talking about historically traumatic events, different kinds of traumatic stressors that our ancestors have encountered and that we still can encounter today. I'm also going to be talking about microaggression distress, so these kinds of things, stereotypes and so forth. And then I'm going to talk about the stress buffering elements of family, culture, language, identity. And I'm going to talk about how the family, culture, and identity basically buffer the impact of historical trauma as well as microaggressions on our wellness outcomes. And when I'm talking about wellness, I don't mean just our physical wellness, but I'm talking about a very holistic perspective, our mind, body, spirit, and it's even tied to land. So it's the overall wellness of people. And the other point I want to point out that just because we experience high rates of historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, and because we might experience high rates of discrimination distress, doesn't mean we all have poor health outcomes or poor mental health. So part of the interesting question is, who does well under those kinds of stressful conditions, and how can we build culturally relevant programs and services and practices that build on the strengths of our communities. So that's one of the elements I'll be stressing today as well. Now let's talk terminology, historical trauma. What do we mean by that? A lot of people have different meanings attached to that in our communities. When I'm talking about historical trauma, I want to acknowledge two things. One is, this isn't something I've invented. It's not a word I've coined. This is something, it's a discourse that's been happening in our community for a really long time, and it's become kind of a phrase to try to capture some of the issues that our communities say is really important to understand around these collective traumatic experiences. So historical trauma has to do with collective, cumulative emotional wounding over and across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events. These are events that don't just target an individual, but they target a whole collective community. Things like forced relocation from traditional homelands, like the Trail of Tears, like my ancestors went through, okay? Genocide, so I'm going to be talking about some of the themes that come up around what constitutes historically traumatic events. But the process that our communities talk a lot about is that the trauma is held personally and can be transmitted over generations. So even family members who have not had a direct experience of the trauma itself can feel the effects of that event generations later. And there's some research that supports that now, and it's mixed, but we'll talk a little bit about that. Some of this type of observation has, from the empirical side, started with work on the Holocaust survivors. And there's a lot of work on intergenerational transmission of trauma. And it's moved into also looking at Japanese internment survivors, Armenian survivors, descendants of their Holocaust, and so forth. So there's been some more empirical work in this area. And you can imagine trying to track trauma over generations and trying to tease out, if you're doing clinical work with a family or with a child, tease out what is the impact over generations on this child, combined with whatever traumatic events they've gone through in their childhood and their lifetime. So it's a bit of a puzzle that we're trying to work through. So I hope to share with you some of the preliminary findings for that puzzle today. These events include planned phenomenon by government and government-sponsored institutions. Boarding school is an example of that, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. It also includes environmental trauma, so it's not trauma just to people, but it can also include historically traumatic events, include impact on the trauma on the environment. And that's particularly salient for Indigenous people, because the separation between body and land is really non-existent in many ways. I mean, these things are the land is us, the land is me. These things are connected, so I'll talk a little bit about that some more. And spiritual trauma, the prohibition of ability to fulfill one's original instructions through their spiritual practices is also part of historical trauma. Am I speaking, I just want to check in, am I speaking too fast? Am I doing okay for you guys? Okay, I've had 2 cups of coffee, so that can happen. In terms of clinical work, it's been really difficult because the multi-generational aspects of trauma continue to be treated quite often as secondary to whatever issues are being seen in the clinical work. The behavior of many children of survivors of massive trauma are frequently misunderstood and basically not treated appropriately because we're not kind of taught to think about that. A lot of our trauma work is centered around kind of DSM ways of understanding, diagnostic statistical manual, understanding PTSD, and it doesn't really allow for this more integrated approach. There is a finding, though, I want to share with you that I think has particular salience for Native communities. Although the findings have been fairly mixed around the transmission of historical trauma and what are the mechanisms for that in family processes. There was one finding that stood out for me, and actually not just one, but a couple of studies that supported this. Basically, when they did some early work on this, they compared children of Holocaust survivors to Jewish children of non-Holocaust survivors. And what they found at baseline was that there was no difference in mental health. Right? However, in observing these kids over time for longitudinal work, what was found was that when a stressor was introduced, the children of Holocaust survivors were much more likely to exhibit subthreshold PTSD symptoms and kind of traumatic stress reactions than the non-Holocaust surviving children. So what that suggests is that for some of our populations and for some individuals and maybe some families, there may be a stress vulnerability that people may have when they encounter stress. So that's linked to intergenerational trauma. And so that's something that we need to be paying attention to. There's been other work by Nagata also on Japanese internment camp survivors and their offspring that also supports some of this. So increased sensitivity or hyperarousal to stressful events, in particular to events that may serve as reminders of colonized status, may predispose some parts of our community to trauma response and corresponding symptoms. So that's another piece to keep in mind. The work by Maria Braveheart, I want to acknowledge the Tikini Network and a lot of the folks who've been doing this work on the ground, especially Lakota-centric specific therapeutic work around this. She identified some of the potential symptoms of dealing with historical trauma response reactions, and that includes things like obsessive rumination about the deceased, intrusive thoughts or dreams or nightmares of historically traumatic events, survivor guilt over not living the experience. And this is very different than kind of the survivor guilt literature that you might see out there. To give you an example, I have a colleague, a friend of mine, whose two grandmothers actually survived, on either side, survived the Wounded Knee massacre. And the way she describes it is she felt that if she began to let go of her pain, and if she began to live really a happy life, that she really felt like she was going to somehow betray her grandmothers. And but she says, I know that's not healthy, and I know that that's not what they intend for me either. But getting past that guilt or transcending the trauma has been a process that she's actually trying to articulate. So these are some of the issues that clinically our community has noted as being a particular issue. Another one, and this gets really funky, you're going to have to go with me a little bit on some of this stuff here. But even in urban communities, we've heard stories like people saying, I'm having these dreams about like the traumatic events, like ancient events, but these aren't my people. So then you've got our indigenous community saying, now I'm relocated to a new area and I'm dealing with historical trauma of the land in this place that is also affecting me. So the kind of vicarious trauma or secondary trauma to other indigenous experiences is another layer here, which I'm not even going to have time to cover, but that's another piece that has come up with communities talking about that. So just an example, this was a Lakota member's dream of a massacre, an example of how historical trauma gets manifest in dreams. In my dream, I had been going back into another life. I saw teepees and Indians camping, and then suddenly I saw white soldiers riding into camp, killing people, raping, cutting throats. It was so real, sights I did not want to see, but had to see against my will, the screaming of children that I did not want to hear, and the only thing I could do was cry. For a long time after that dream, I felt depressed, as if all of life had been drained from me. I was still going to school, too young to bear such dreams, and I grieved because we had to live a life we were not put on this earth for. Okay. So some of the examples of survivor guilt, and this is some of the items that we use in some of our work. I don't want to talk to my family about my problems because I don't want to give them more burdens. I feel guilty over having advantages more so than other Native people. If I feel too good, it's like betrayal to my family members who died. There's also unresolved grief and mourning is another manifestation. It's hard for me to mourn for my ancestors since I don't know where they are buried. It's an example. I feel like I must take on some of the pain in my community. Sometimes I think if we could just find the right medicine, we would be healed. So the other piece is this kind of romanticization, this return to just the perfect indigenous way, then we would all be okay again, instead of recognizing that, our cultures also evolve and transition. So there have been some work on gender issues in historical trauma. And this, again, is primarily a little bit out of Maria Braveheart's work, but also from the Holocaust literature. And basically what the literature suggests is that women tend to carry more trauma and feel more of a burden to heal the pain of others, which isn't surprising given some gender issues. Feminist theory on development suggests that girls' sense of self develops via the bonds of empathy and with the mother. While little boys differentiate from others, this is based on a Western model, little girls' sense of identity comes from their ability to connect and feel alike. And according to the Holocaust literature, the daughter who is constructed in her family as the emotional one may in fact be carrying the burden of expressing the presence of trauma in the family that is being denied or disowned. So while it's becoming more common for clinicians to look into a person's own trauma history, it's still unfortunately not the norm. To ask about the traumatic experiences of their parents and ancestors. One of the things that we do in more clinical work in Indigenous communities, and this is based off of some of the work of Eduardo Duran and some of the work that I did in communities a while ago, quite often if a person walks in and they sit down, you don't just ask them about themselves, you start there, but you also ask who else is in the room with us today. And that's recognizing the collective sense of people's identities, especially for Indigenous people. But also it's acknowledging that it's starting to make the direct link that the historical trauma or the intergenerational trauma that they may be carrying and negotiating, they're literally bearing the burden of their ancestors who are also present in the room today. So who else are we healing? Who else are we working on here today, not just yourself? And what's really exciting is it's a really incredible moment because when people are sometimes at their lowest, right, they don't feel very powerful. But actually, it's part of decolonizing therapeutic practices is to help people reclaim and rename and decolonize. And one way to do that is to reframe the experience as the most opportune moment to be powerful. That right now you're in the most powerful place you could ever be because you're not here just alone. You're carrying the grief and mourning of stuff from your ancestors, and you could identify that through soul wound timelines and genograms. I'll talk about that later. But you also have the opportunity not only to heal your ancestors by healing yourself, but you're also healing the next 7 generations. So it's a very powerful place. And I think that's a critical difference between a lot of Western therapeutic approaches and Indigenous approaches, which is we're more spatially oriented, right? In this moment, I am my ancestor's granddaughter in this very moment. In this moment, I'm my future generation's ancestor. So I'm all those things right now. So it's a very spatial way of orienting oneself to not just to the physical world here, but the ancestral world and the future generations. So if you can reintroduce that into the therapeutic work that you're doing, it gives a great opportunity to recognize the collective that the person walks in with if you're working with a parent, for example, working with their children, but it also reintroduces the power that people have to make those changes in their lives. Okay, I digressed. I got ahead of myself. Now, there's been some work that said that people think that the degree of ancestor trauma would make a difference. So how traumatized were your ancestors would make a difference as to what kind of manifestation would happen generations later. But actually, studies show that this is not necessarily the case in general, except for 2 specific types of trauma. Historically traumatic events that involve losing spouse or a child clearly is much more directly linked to later generational problems in mental health for the descendants, including anger, problems in intimacy, and problems with dependency. This is critical for Indigenous people if you think about the boarding school experience, right? Nobody really does a lot of work there's a lot of work on the survivors of boarding school, of the children themselves, but there's not a lot of work on the parents and the profound loss that they experienced in losing their children. And in some cases, only the family was divided. Some kids stayed home and other kids left. So how did that dynamic impact the whole family? So in a study of Jewish Holocaust survivors and their descendants, length of time spent in the camps did not basically make a difference, nor did the number of relatives lost. It was that primary relationship to their children that was really critical, or their spouses. The age at which the trauma occurs also does not appear to change impact over generations, but having 2 traumatized parents does matter. So if both parents experience the historically traumatic event, there's more likely to be some passing on of some issues in future generations. The type of communication used is another factor that's been identified in terms of family research. that matters. So how parents talk about historical trauma influences the degree of historical trauma in future generations. There's two issues here. One is silence, that there is a lot of research on the role of silence and not talking about it. And actually, and that makes sense if you think about PTSD and avoidance symptoms, not wanting to talk about these things. But silence actually is really difficult because silence can actually, what the research has shown is that children or children and grandchildren of the Holocaust survivors, for example, fill in that information with much more worse information than perhaps what the parent even went through. So there's some issues around the silence, so the parents not talking about it to try to prevent the pain from passing on actually creates a dynamic that makes it even more difficult for the children and grandchildren to process their information. There's a lot of ways children also bear the burden of managing their parental pain and avoiding topics, avoiding talking about it, or there's a lot of stuff about guilt-inducing kind of work. And again, that's on Jewish Holocaust survivor literature. But my own clinical work, I'll just give you kind of an example of a situation that happened where a woman came in to talk with me about how to come out to her family. And she was really concerned that that was going to have a negative impact on coming out as a lesbian to her family. And so I was, of course, doing a family history and getting a sense of who she was and where she was coming from. And I found out in the family history that she was a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I thought, well, that's important information to know. And I said, well, what would happen if you came out to your mom? And she said, oh, she would disintegrate. And I thought, wow. And I thought, okay, we have some Holocaust trauma stuff here to deal with that might be actually more important than this whole coming out issue. And when I asked her to reflect on her words and talk about her role in her family and how does that impact her current roles and her relationships, she just hadn't realized how much of a burden she was carrying to manage the feelings of the household and the feelings that was all about the Holocaust trauma. And so we actually spent the next 6 months talking about that. And 6 months later, she's finally like, okay, I'm ready to come out now. But, so watching for how these things get manifest is really important because you never know how, even the children don't know how much they're carrying. So silence sometimes creates a sense of dread and secrecy about events. The more profound the silence, the more pervasive the inner impact of the events are on the children. That's what they've been saying in the literature. So without the freedom to inquire about histories, children may be left with a sense of profound dread. And so people talk about this dread. The missing knowledge takes on toxic meanings. I think a great example of that is my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was a daughter of a survivor of the Trail of Tears. Both of her parents survived the Trail of Tears. My great-grandmother knew how to speak English but refused to speak English. And I heard these great stories from my grandfather, and my grandmother. My grandmother, when she went to go live with my grandfather and his mother, my great-grandma, or his grandmother rather, the way she dealt with her historical trauma as a child of survivors is she had a rifle that she used to carry from room to room. Literally, she'd walk in and she'd put a rifle against a wall. So everywhere she went, she had a rifle. I don't know about you. I would say that's pretty profound historical trauma if you have that sense of dread and worry that you could be removed or attacked or have a problem again. My grandma was really afraid of her, needless to say. Didn't help she didn't speak Choctaw. My grandma was Chickasaw on that side, but she didn't speak her language, so. Okay, so the other piece that matters is how society responds to historically traumatic events. One of the biggest pervasive issues we deal with in this generation is a constant denial to Indigenous people about the impact of colonization and historically traumatic events on our everyday lives. People are like, you're conquered, get over it, that kind of language. And the reactions, what we're finding is that the reactions of society to survivors of massive trauma actually has a significant impact on their health and wellness, and their ability to actually integrate the traumatic experiences and transform them and transcend them. So many people experiencing historical trauma today encounter a pervasive societal reaction that includes indifference, disbelief, avoidance, repression, denial of the community's historical experiences. On the more profound end, there's actually a reframing of those experiences as part of the collective national identity to be celebrated. And that has a whole other added piece to it. So for example, when you have reenactments of events during like the Civil War period or doing things are called great battles, for some of our communities, those weren't battles, those were actual massacres. So, you know, having to be in a community where these events are reenacted over and over has an effect on a community. So we'll talk a little bit about that. In the Jewish Holocaust literature, they also talk about memorial candles. And these are folks who are children of survivors who carry a burden of this grief. And they kind of, it's almost like a family therapeutic approach, a systems approach, that there's someone in the family who carries the grief of the ancestors and the knowledge of that grief. And Maria Braveheart actually looked at that from a Lakota perspective, and she actually says, well, there may be whole clans that might carry that grief. So it's not just individuals, but whole clans hold these memories, or the memorial are the memorial people. So she argues that some Native communities may have a strong proclivity for being memorial people due to an inherent cultural emphasis on ancestor spirits and their impairment of traditional bereavement in some communities. Okay. I talked a little bit about the Western and Indigenous approaches to healing and the spatial view, so I think that's critical to keep in mind as I'm going to start talking about the impact of these events. And then finally, I want to acknowledge a couple things about historical trauma as a researcher, what a bear it is to do. One of the big issues is, you know, we think of historical trauma as a causal factor, as an etiological agent. So there are these events that cause PTSD, or there's these events that cause health risk behaviors. But also, you'll hear our communities talk about historical trauma as an outcome, that there's some kind of historical trauma response, or what I call a colonial trauma response that we're carrying. And the reason why it's important to make a distinction between the event and the outcome is because the outcome is tied to culturally specific manifestations of our grief, of other kinds of issues that we might be dealing with. But the other piece is, sometimes there's some things in our communities that we call cultural, when in fact, part of the disentangling from and decolonizing work means that we actually have to question that and say, is that part of our original instructions? Or is that a collective colonial trauma response or a survival strategy that our communities have come up with to survive some of these colonial moments? You guys with me on that a little bit? I'll give you an example. When I went to do some work on diabetes and cardiovascular disease in a particular community in the Northwest, I met with the grandmothers in advance, and the grandmas were great. I sat down with them, and the first things out of their mouth was, don't be sending any skinny white ladies in here to tell us what our body's like and, you know, how to eat. And she goes, we already know, we need to eat better, we need to exercise, and so don't send any of those skinny white ladies here. And then they went on to say, well, you know, I think what's happening, you know, is we have a different body type. And, you know, we've always had big babies. You know, that's how it is. We have big babies. And I said, okay. Now, what they didn't know was I had done some historical archival research, so I saw pictures of what this community looked like 100 years ago. They were lean and mean. And you know, more square-shaped body types, it's true, different than standards that would be based on European standards. But I was not going to say that to the grandmas. I knew better. So what I started thinking about was, you know, there's a reason they're saying this. There is a survival reason they're saying this. There is a cultural protective process going on right now that I have to honor. And somehow historical trauma is connected to this. And somehow we have to deal with the fact that in this community, obesity rates and diabetes rates are soaring. So I'm like, what's going on here? So this is, you know, as a former clinician, I get to ask my dumb questions, you know. And so I asked the community, I said, well, let's start with, what were your original instructions as a people for how you related to food and how you related to the land? And first of all, they're like, well, no researchers usually ask us those questions. And this is important. Whenever you do historical trauma work, and from a therapeutic perspective or a research perspective, we always start with the goodness. Always start with the beauty. Always start with the original instructions that people might know or not know. And if they don't know, there's ways to get at it. For example, I had one person say, I don't know what it was. And I said, well, let's look at your calendar. Your calendar. So we pulled off the calendar off the wall with this one community member. And, you know, if you look at the calendar, from an indigenous calendars, they're tied to the land and food. All the months are tied to that, so you can start the story there if people don't know their original instructions. So there's tools, there's ways, there's things at our fingertips. So I asked them, what were your original instructions that you could share with me as an outsider, because I want to respect the sacredness of those stories. So these grandmas started talking and said, oh yeah, when this first butterfly comes out, that's when we get these kinds of berries. And they said, well, we haven't passed that on to our children. And they talked about that. So I let that happen for a while. And then, so I said, well, when did that get interrupted? Now I'm introducing historical trauma. When did that get interrupted? What was the first interruption, the big interruption from you being able to fulfill your original instructions around food? And they said, oh, when we got moved here to this reservation, you know. And I said, well, what happened? She said, we starved. There was a great famine. We lost a lot of people. I said, well, what did you do to protect your children? So I bring it back to the kids. What did you do to protect your children? And they said, oh, we always fed our children first. And I said, so what else was happening there during that period? Well, then they brought all these commodities in, and we started eating all this commodity food. Yeah. And so the kids always ate first, right? Yeah. And the plump ones survived. Yeah. Oh. All of a sudden, it becomes clear that the grandmas in that generation made it, and the grandfathers made it an important intervention for their children and their community to survive. Overfeed your kids. They're guaranteed to be likely to survive this famine. So that was a cultural survival strategy. And as soon as they figured that out, I didn't have to say it, that was their figuring out. They were then able to have the conversation, well, what are we doing in this generation? And I said, well, are your children still starving? And they're like, no. And I said, but it sounds like you're still doing this cultural survival strategies for our kids because you're honoring the traditions of your grandmothers. Yeah. And I said, but is it working in this generation? No. And I said, but we still have malnourishment though. It's just a different kind. So I said, so now we have an opportunity to come up with a new survival strategy based on the original instructions again. So that's an example of something that starts off as people call a cultural experience, but when you kind of disentangle it a little bit, you can see where the cultural original instructions are there. Feed your children, make sure your children are well, right? You know, and we see that in our communities. The grandmas will go without eating to make sure everyone eats. So that's an example of teasing out cultural trauma response from things that people might call as cultural. So that's part of something to think about. So that's a historical trauma as an outcome. Then the other piece is historical trauma as a mechanism or a pathway. How does it get transmitted? How does this work? How come it gets transmitted for some families but not other families? What's going on there? So an example is, and I'll show you in the data a little bit later, in our study in New York City, in the community there, is interesting. We were trying to figure out who would bear the stories of these historically traumatic events. And if I was to ask you guys right now, who do you think would be in your community, if you thought by age or gender or any kind of status a person might hold, who do you think would be more likely to hold most of these stories? What was that? Children? Children, maybe. Okay. And what else? Who else might know these stories? Elders, right? I thought elders, women if it's a more matrilineal society. It depends on who the cultural bearers are in our various communities. Interestingly, we found it was actually the Two-Spirit people. The people who were self-identified as gay, lesbian, bisexual had higher level of recollection of historically traumatic events for their communities than the heterosexual folks. So it ended up being much more of a predictive factor than age or gender, which was interesting. So it made us ask more questions. So I went back to the community and I said, well, how is that? And the community, the Two-Spirit community, said, well, that's because a lot of us are the cultural storytellers for our communities. So we bear those stories. So I'm going to get to that in a little bit later. And then finally, there's Other issues, there's historically traumatic related factors, things like unresolved grief and loss. You know, that's connected to historical trauma, but it also has its own set of symptoms and other kinds of issues that people negotiate. So in New York City, in the Turtle Island Native Wellness Project, we actually worked with the community to create a historically traumatic event scale. It's, you know, and you imagine urban communities, what a struggle that is, right? Because we're not dealing with tribally specific events. We're having to identify events that cut across tribes that we can kind of agree on as historically traumatic events. So things like forced relocation, desecration of traditional lands through environmental toxins, radioactive dumping, things like that. So we had to come up with these kind of meta categories so that anybody with any other tribe could kind of plug in and say, yeah, that's an event that my family experienced or I experienced or not. And so these are some of the examples of things that our communities identified in New York City as being historically traumatic events that helped us develop the historically traumatic event scale. And out of our work in our communities, we developed 3 scales, the Historical Trauma Index, the Colonial Trauma Response Scale, and the Microaggression Scale. I'm not going to talk much about the Colonial Trauma Response Scale, except to say that the reason why we developed that was when I was going over a PTSD measure in the community, and this also happened with the Microaggression Scale, community members were like, post-traumatic what? We're in trauma every day. Walking down the street as an Indigenous person, we're having trauma. So we're not post anything, so that's not helpful. So we had to kind of tease out, and so what we teased out with the microaggression scale is what are those everyday injustices and hassles and demeaning experiences Native people experience, and the colonial trauma responses, what are some of the Native-specific symptoms that we might also have, manifest that PTSD just doesn't capture. So one of the major themes that came up was genocide. I'm going to have a couple of pictures, but not too many difficult ones. But the communities really talked about genocide as being a major factor in historical trauma. And they talked about major events, such as Wounded Knee and Sand Creek and other kinds of major massacres. That's an example from Wounded Knee. And, you know, you don't have to go far to look in our history to find these events. You know, part of my work in doing historical trauma and intergenerational trauma work, and not just my work, but all of our work, has been, I go to the congressional record and I go to other kinds of records to say, well, look, people really said these things, and people really had policies to kill Indians. This isn't, you know, a political move. It's not a political ideology. It's actually a fact. So here's a quote from General Tecumseh Sherman. He said, the more we can kill this year, the less we'll have to be killed in the next war. For the more I see of these Indians, the more convinced am I that they have all to be killed or be maintained as a species of paupers, which I think is pretty interesting. Then we went through the reservation allotment and relocation periods, and I'm like collapsing tons of history here, so I'm only going for the last couple hundred years. I could start longer than that, but for our sake, let's stick with the last 200. This is a food ration day for one of the communities. You can see the big sacks, food ration lines. There's internment camps and relocations. This is an example. How many of you know about the Aleutian and the Ungagak people who were relocated and removed and interned during World War II in Alaska? A lot of people don't know that history. So there's a lot of issues that a lot of our Alaska Native communities are dealing with from this experience. There's a quote here from one of the men. In 1942, my wife and our 4 children were whipped away from our home. All our possessions were left for Mother Nature to destroy. I tried to pretend it was really a dream, and this could not happen to me and my dear family. It's important that I'm not talking about natural disasters, too. Okay, that's an important thing. A lot of people think about, like, Hurricane Katrina is a historical traumatic event. Now, this is an interesting issue. It was a natural disaster, but the response triggered historically traumatic response reactions from a lot of communities. The response became a historically traumatic event for a number of African American people. So, okay. And then relocation, just wanted to put that up there. Even though families, quote, voluntarily relocated with a lot of promises to a lot of our cities, a lot of these were kind of broken treaties in another sense. and the pieces didn't go through. But there's a lot of coercive relocation that happened during that period because people were starving back home and they had to go to the cities to find food and jobs. The community also identified the environmental and spiritual traumas. These are buffalo skulls. Back to General Sheridan said the best way to kill the Lakota was to kill the buffalo. And it was very interesting. A lot of non-Indigenous people understand that to mean interrupting a person's food source. But this historical trauma, this type of event, isn't about interrupting subsistence patterns. It's actually about interrupting a people's ability to fulfill their original instructions. It's a much deeper spiritual assault. And so that's another example that the communities came up saying, listen, there's these environmental traumas that attack us at our soul. Okay? And then we have other reminders. Having, and this is a difficult one because a lot of people get excited to go to Mount Rushmore and see the president's heads carved there. But what that means for the people who are there is very different. These are very sacred areas, very, very sacred lands. And to have the symbolism of these particular presidents also carved in, who were not friends of the Indian by any means, has whole other meaning for a community if you have to go and see that every day, not to mention the impact. And then there's direct environmental toxins. Native communities are some of the most bombed communities in the world for nuclear testing. The Shoshone peoples in Nevada, for example. I'm using the example here at the Marshall Islands with the Rungelap peoples. And this is part of the crazy making about historical trauma is people tell you, well, you're not really doing badly. Everything's really okay. And then generations later, it's like, no, like we're dying of cancer. There's a connection here. And so post-World War II, the U.S. exploded a bomb there that was 1,300 times more destructive than bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was the first of 66 nuclear tests there. The fallout included what the community called jellyfish babies. These were children that were born with no bones. Despite residents being told that there's no serious radiation until 1982, the U.S. found island Rongelap finally, at that point, too dangerous to live on and helped to relocate people. So between 1954 and 58, 1 out of 3 births ended in deaths. So that's a major trauma for that community. And part of the trauma making is the crazy making aspects of it, right? People denying it being an event. That's when the bombs, to show you what it looked like. And then boarding school period. Now this is really critical if you look at family dynamics, impact on children, mental health. The boarding school period, I don't know how much our viewers and you know a lot about it. I know there's a number of you who probably are well versed in it, but bear with me for a minute because there's some folks who don't know and they're thinking I'm talking about Andover or, and I'm not. In the late 1800s, around 1879, there were mission schools prior to this, so I want to acknowledge that, and there were mission day schools prior to this. But in 1879, the federal government started doing a couple of different things in terms of Indian policy that's really important to know about. One of the things that the government decided was that we were more human than they thought we were before. And what happened was 3 major movements happened. One is we became eligible to be declared insane. I'll talk about that in a minute. The other was we became educable. This is where the boarding school piece comes in. And the third is our religions became outlawed and prohibited. So these are 3 major movements that happened simultaneously. General Pratt was selected to be the first beginner of this idea of forming off-reservation boarding schools where kids were taken from their homes and placed far away. And the idea is they didn't want any contact with community or culture or family. And General Pratt is interesting because his job was prior to that was he directed and developed Fort Marion Prison in Florida from 1872 to 1875, where he actually was in charge of Native prisoners of war. So that's who they selected to be in charge of Indian education. So that's an important piece to note. The idea that was, he said, let's kill the man to save the Indian. There was forced removal for a lot of these kids with no return until they were young adults, back to their communities. During the summer, when school was out of session, these kids were sent off, for example, at Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. These kids would be sent off to New Jersey and New York to be indentured servants, basically in people's households. So by 1909, there were more than 25 off-reservation boarding schools, more than at least 100,000, we think, Native children forced to attend these schools during that period. And again, that's a rough estimate because we don't know. And attendance was mandatory or the parents would be imprisoned or fined. In 1895, 19 Hopi men were imprisoned at Alcatraz for refusing to send their children to these schools. So here's an example of Carlisle. These schools were militaristic in fashion, not surprising since it was modeled off of a prison, guy who ran a prison. Look how young these kids are. Some of them are really young, 3, 4 years old, being sent off to these schools. Now, what do we know? They were not parented. They were forced to not speak their language, and in some cases encountered torture and physical brutality if they did anything cultural. They encountered sexual abuse at incredibly high rates. Unfortunately, a lot of the whole priest phenomenon, when that came out not too long ago, in our communities we're like, well, duh. They've been sending not the best and the brightest to our communities for a really long time. So these kids were disproportionately abused. In some cases, there's some documentation, for example, in Canada, because they're doing the work in this area, 90% of kids were sexually abused in some communities by the priest. So it's pretty major. So what happens to this generation? They don't learn traditional knowledge around their stories, around how to relate to each other, how to parent, how to discipline, how to express themselves in all kinds of ways. And what they learn is harsh physical punishment, militaristic ways of living. So you can imagine the impact. Now, if you think about what we just know from the historical trauma literature, what impact does that have on the whole family system, even the ones who remain behind? Right, the loss of the children is really profound. We know that that has an impact intergenerationally. And here's a dorm living. So here's an example. Here's Tom Torino, a young Navajo man who first went to Carlisle. How many of you saw rabbit-proof fence? You see that? Yeah. Same thing, right? The same kind of process here. In a rabbit-proof fence, this was, Tom Torino was used as an example of the success of these schools to get wealthy benefactors to give money to schools. So this is Tom 3 years later. There's a picture of a young boy at Carlisle. Kids' hairs were shaved, the hair was shaved. For a lot of our communities, that's a sign of mourning. You know, there's stories of kids saying, the adults now saying, as a kid, when my grandfather was taken, he told me that, or when in some cases when I was taken to boarding school, they shaved my head, and I thought my parents had died. Yeah. So, okay, this is a young group of Apache children, young people. This is them, same kids, a little bit later. Okay, so part of the boarding school experience was also to missionize and Christianize Indigenous people. So the idea was to strip people of their Indigenous life ways and ways of relating to the world and cultural expression, replace it with Western ways, and primarily Christianity. So there's a lot of conversion practices that were going on. At the same time, the Court of Indian Offenses was put in place where it became prohibited for Indigenous people to do their dances, any kind of cultural expression or any kind of religious expression. If you're caught, you could be imprisoned for up to 6 months, or your food rations would be withheld from your communities. That didn't really get overturned until 1978. Okay, so that's important to note. And even now, still a lot of our religious practices aren't fully embraced. There's still some issues. So here's an example at Omak St. Mary's School. And then you wonder why people don't seek health services and health care. We have a lot of health-related historical trauma. There's a long history of medical impropriety in Indian country where Native people have been experimented on. Examples of trachoma eye surgeries that were done in the 1930s on American Indians in the Southwest, leaving thousands of people blind. It was experimental, it wasn't an approved surgical procedure, and it didn't prove to be helpful. And it actually blinded a lot of people or left people without eyelids. So as recently as 1976, the Indian Health Service acknowledged that it conceded that there was some kind of sterilization of Native women without their proper informed consent. We don't know the extent of it because The paper trail has been lost, but they at least conceded that. Okay, so, and there's some issues around TB. So you can understand why there's justifiable mistrust for people accessing our services. And then mental health. In 1902, there was the Hiawatha Insane Asylum that was established in Canton, South Dakota. And again, that was historically traumatic for a number of reasons. One is it wasn't staffed by nurses, doctors, psychiatrists, or anybody qualified to run a psychiatric facility. It was basically a prison camp. And it was so deplorable that finally, in 1926, it was closed because everyone felt it was too inhumane. But during that period, eventually they did get some doctors and nurses in there. And one of the head facilitators of the administrators used to open up the doors in the summertime to let white tourists come in to see the crazy Indians. So it became a tourist stop during that period. So these are major atrocities. But the piece that's not part of this historic record is who were these people who were targeted in the late 1800s. At the same time, our cultural and spiritual practices were being outlawed. So a lot of our communities actually think our medicine people were taken there as another way of kind of having destruction in our cultural lifeways. Okay, deep breath. We're past the historical trauma part, and I'm moving into microaggression distress. This is where it's important to think about chronic stress and the impact on the health and wellness of our children and our families. Historical trauma has a critical impact. It has to do with an acute event that occurred and that it's carried over generations. Microaggression distress is different. Microaggression distress has to do with the everyday interpersonal experiences Indigenous people have. And why is this important? Because chronic and persistent trauma has much more profound health impact. Things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, things like that, than a single event trauma might have. So we're talking about long-term issues. The other thing is these everyday injustices, they're really hard to articulate and define and talk about, and there's a lot of disbelief held about them. So our communities talked about it. So microaggressions are the chronic everyday injustices that we endure. They're the interpersonal and environmental messages. So it doesn't mean that I'll be walking down the street and be called squaw. That would be a microaggression, be an event, but it's not a historically traumatic event, it's a microaggression. But it can also have to do with images that are in our environment, or the lack of images in our environment that is part of that microaggression distress. So these are verbal and nonverbal encounters that basically places the burden on us as Indigenous people or the recipient of that encounter to negotiate them. Daryl Wing-Soo has done a lot of work on this for communities of color. We'll talk about it more from a Native perspective. But what makes them chronic and difficult is these are the kind of events where you're like standing in line and you're waiting in line, and then the person asks the person behind you, who might be white, to come forward to get ahead of you in the line to get served, I don't know, at McDonald's or something. And you sit there and you go, is that because, did I just get dissed, or what is that, And you try to negotiate it and figure out in your head. So the burden falls on the person to figure out, was that a discriminatory event or not? Because sometimes they're not always clear. And then it falls on the burden to the person to decide whether they're going to address it. Because if you address it, there will be a conflict. You just don't know how bad the conflict's going to be. So you have to think about, do I want it? Is it worth a hassle? Am I going to deal with it? Then there's a third piece to it. You have to think about the intentionality of the person who you just had that experience with. Did they mean it? Is it just ignorance? Did they just not know better? This is someone I care about, and I can't believe they just said that to me. So there's three types of microaggressions. There's micro-insults. These are behaviors that convey rudeness, insensitivity, or unfair treatment. A good example of that for those who might be students in the audience, if you're a Native student and you're in class and you finally say, I need to bring up another issue about Native issues, and all the kids and the other students in class go, oh, that's a micro-insult. So now you have a term for it. It's a micro-insult. Micro-invalidations are communications that nullify the reality or identity of Native people. Being asked all the time if you're a real Indian is a good example of that. It's tiring. And that's not just for mixed bloods like myself. I'm talking about full bloods get it too. And so always being asked, to state who you are and where you come from in ways that no other group gets ask for that kind of authentication. And then microassaults are characterized by explicit racial derogatory attacks or purposeful ones. Those are the ones where you know the person knows that they shouldn't be saying what they're doing, but they do it anyways. And quite often you're told to lighten up, it's just a joke, what's the big deal? Those are more of the microassaults. I'm going to give you a couple of pictures of it, and then we're going to take a break. Okay, gives no meaning to Dances with Wolves. Example, the eroticization of Indigenous people is a good example. The objectification, appropriation of representations of things that are sacred to us, like eagle feathers and other things like that. And this is Miss Universe in 2004. And then, of course, pictures like that. And then here, remember this? That's a microassault. Associating Native people with alcohol. Especially as if we give our children tiny papooses, it says there, 3 ounces on I got that at a wall drug. And then ads like this, contemporary ads. It gets really tiring seeing this stuff all the time. And what this does is it cartoonizes us. It makes us unidimensional. It makes us not be seen. It renders us invisible because we are not these things. And then we're told we're being honored. But I'm honoring you, dude. The appropriation of spiritual practices, misappropriation of our practices. And then it has an effect not only on us, but our children, and also on people who, quote, don't know any better, right? It also has the effect on people who perpetrate, because they have been taught these same messages. And so here's a young boy saying to this young girl, really, you don't look like an Indian, because this is what he's carrying in his head. Because our invisibility has been reinforced through microaggressive experiences. So I'm going to stop there. We're going to take a little break. I'm going to come back and give you some of the data and some interventions. Thank you. I just wanted to share something, just a kind of a story about one more example of microaggression distress, since we kind of cruised through it so quickly. But just to give you an example of one that I experienced personally, when I first started out on faculty at a university, which will remain nameless, I was asked by a colleague to come and give a lecture on American Indian issues. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. And she said, great, can you come dressed as an Indian? And I was like, okay. And so then the burden fell on me. So I had to think about our power differentials or status differentials. I had to think about, did she mean what she really said? Or does she just not know any better? And she was an immigrant to the country, so I thought, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. I said, well, maybe she doesn't understand. Maybe we're having a communication difficulty here. So I gave her the benefit of the doubt, and I said, I am kind of dressed as an Indian every time I put clothes on. So I said, so that doesn't really, that's kind of, I didn't say insulting, but I got as close to that as I could muster. And so I said, I kind of don't understand what you're really asking me. And she said, well, just like dress in your costume. And I go, okay, to give a lecture, you want me to come in my traditional dress to class? And I said, no, that's not acceptable. I can't, no, that's not okay. And I said, you probably don't realize it, but that's kind of insulting. And I'm still trying to be as gentle as I can, and also feeling, a little bit vulnerable because I didn't have tenure at the time. And so then she said, well, okay, if you don't want to wear your outfit, then why don't you wear earrings or something? So I said, okay, tell you what, I will definitely come speak in your class if I can talk about whatever I want around Indian issues. She said, yeah, talk about anything. I said, and don't worry, I'll come dressed as an Indian. A week later, I came. Can you imagine what I wore? I got the best suit out of my closet. I put away all my native jewelry. And I walked in and I introduced myself to the class and I said, class, I'm here dressed as an Indian today, and we're going to hear a lecture on microaggressions. What we do with those microaggressive events is what matters, and it's stressful. Because sometimes people try to talk us out of understanding those events as being discriminatory, and like, oh, that's not so bad, or they didn't really mean it. But the problem is intention even if someone doesn't mean it, or people are even well-intentioned and sometimes do microaggressions. And let me just acknowledge, I've microaggressed others as well. We've all done it. If you've been socialized in this country, we've microaggressed at some point. So part of the work and part of our healing ourselves and healing with each other is to begin to recognize those when we start to have them or we have those experiences. And if somebody's struggling with trying to make sense of an experience, really holding that and listening to that and saying, well, that's clearly was really upsetting to you, instead of trying to talk them out of the experience, because that's actually not helpful, usually. Okay, so we talked about historical trauma, we talked about microaggressions. I just need to highlight that also in Native communities, we experience some of the highest rates of violence in the country. So you've got not only historical trauma you're dealing with, but in everyday discrimination, but a lot of traumatic life events that our communities are disproportionately exposed to. And all of that impacts our wellness and our functioning. We have some of the highest injury rates in the country. I'm going to skip through this because of time, but I just wanted to highlight something about violence in Native women. Native women are victims of violent crimes 2.5 times the national average. The most disturbing finding, and Amnesty International actually came out and did this beautiful report just, I think, a little over a year ago, that basically said the United States needs to take a hard look at how they're dealing with Indigenous women, because Indigenous women's violence in this country is amazing. 1 out of 3 Native women can expect to be raped in their lifetime. 1 out of 3. Now, the interesting thing is, and also when we are attacked, we endure much more physical and sexual brutality. The interesting thing is that 70% of the perpetrators are non-Native. So unlike other sexual assault research that's done in communities, violence tends to be within, same race, whatever that construct is, but same community. Whereas for Native women, it's not. It tends to be primarily white men perpetrating against Native women. It's a different dynamic than you see. And the fact that there's a lot of outmarriage in terms of interracial marriage, there's other dynamics. So when you're doing family work with these families, it's something to keep in mind as another added issue. We did do some research in the Turtle Island Native Wellness project that I mentioned earlier to do some preliminary work on the historical trauma work. And I just wanted to share some of the very preliminary findings that came from that study. What we found was that historical trauma exposure over generations was associated with contemporary post-traumatic stress disorder and attendance at boarding school. And the number of historically traumatic events over generations was associated with depressive symptoms. I'm raising this because I'm going to share with you some other data that we have now that also supports this. So 2 different studies are kind of finding this similar findings. Prohibition of cultural expression was particularly associated with depressive symptoms and anxiety. And interestingly, in the new research that we're doing, this is a major factor in anxiety, cultural prohibition of expression. And forced relocation was also associated with depression. We also found that historically traumatic events were associated with drug use, alcohol use, risky sex, and as well as poor mental health. In terms of Native women and looking at violence for Native women, in that study, 65% had at least one form of interpersonal violence. So 65% is very high, very high. 48% had a reported history of rape in their lifetime, and 41% had at least 2 types of violence. Now, we thought this was maybe an anomaly, even though we did a form of respondent-driven sampling in that particular community. So we did some sampling methods that would lead us to be able to be a little bit more thinking that our data was generalizable. But we actually found this to be true in the other work that we're doing now that I'm going to share with you in a minute. Andy Smith helps us to contextualize the violence against Native women. She says, colonizers have long tried to crush the spirit of the Indian peoples and blunt their will to resist through colonization. One of the most devastating weapons of conquest has been sexual violence. So another way this gets manifested, this was a study on HIV risk prevention, or HIV prevention for Native communities. And it was interesting. In a different study, Fisher and colleagues found that white men who had sex with both white and Native women were significantly less likely to use condoms with Alaska Native women. So this is different kinds of, I'm broadening the definition of violence here in terms of exposure to problems. In our TINWIP study, we found that sexual violence was related to HIV sexual risk behaviors. Not surprisingly, women who had experienced any type of violence had a dramatically much higher likelihood of engaging in HIV sexual risk behaviors compared to women who have no history of violence. So ever been victimized or being multiply victimized in sexual assault were also associated with increase in sexual risk behaviors. Now, I talked briefly about colonial trauma response, the survival guilt stuff we talked about earlier. Also, the vicarious and secondary traumatization, I also mentioned earlier in terms of feeling like when you hear other people's histories, you also feel traumatized, you carry that trauma. We created a scale. I don't have time to go into it, but just from a more clinical perspective, some of the findings from the TINWIP study that I wanted to share with you was what we found was that historical trauma and microaggression distress were related, and they both had small direct effects on post-traumatic stress disorder. But what's most interesting is that colonial trauma response, or that historical trauma response, buffered, or not didn't buffer, I'm sorry, mediated the relationship between historical trauma and PTSD. So what that means is basically colonial trauma response, when we do our assessments of PTSD in clinical settings, we have to also be asking, because colonial trauma response accounted for about 14% of the variance in post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So what that means is about 14% of the symptoms in this particular sample were culturally specific manifestations of trauma responses tied to Native cultural experience and worldviews. So when we do PTSD assessments, it can't be standard DSM PTSD kind of assessments. It has to incorporate Indigenous understandings, Indigenous worldviews, because that's part of that PTSD package. And then if you don't disentangle it, you miss a huge opportunity to really do some healing work that could be really beneficial to the community or the person or the family you're working with. Historical trauma was also related to identity in that early study. Basically, having historically traumatic events over generations was associated with externalizing identity attitudes. What that has to do with is when one finally takes those colonizing, oppressed attitudes and takes it outside of oneself, what happens? People get angry. And so that anger kind of stage is related to historical trauma, and it's also associated with lowered sense of actualization or integration of identity. And then in that same study, here's the finding I talked about earlier. You could see two-spirits had higher rates of child physical and sexual abuse compared to heterosexuals, and also were more likely to have knowledge or carry the knowledge of historical trauma. And out of that work, I got into HIV work not because I was into HIV. I actually had been a clinician doing mental health work. I had been doing work on identity and mental health. And then, of course, when I started doing identity and mental health, I started looking at trauma and violence. And I moved to New York City, and an elder, literally, I'm not kidding, within 2 weeks of being there, I met with some of the elders in the community there, and the elder said, well, we have HIV here, and I need you to do HIV research. Because I said, how can I be of service and help to the community? And I said, oh, I don't know much about HIV. And she said, well, I'm not really asking you. So that's how I got into HIV research. So I said, okay, I'm going to learn all about HIV. And I'm so thankful I did, because it's all connected, right? It's all connected. And it was out of that work, and then also work with a two-spirit, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit community. So I'm going to use the term two-spirit as a shorthand for that, in working with the communities there. And some of these findings kind of compelled us to look more closely at our two-spirit communities across the country to see what kind of risk issues there are. Now, this has you're saying, okay, we're doing children's mental health. This has major implications, because for all of our two-spirit children and gay, lesbian, bisexual, or sexually questioning youth, or gender identity expression questioning youth, there's a lot of need here that really go unrecognized. And then looking at historical trauma microaggressions related to some of these populations kind of really illuminates some of the real critical issues we should be looking at. So I'm going to share some of the data from the HONOR Project. The HONOR Project was a 6-site national study funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. They did try to defund us only a year into this. I don't know if any of you heard a couple of years, about 4 years ago, when the Congress was trying to get rid of 4 grants at the NIH. It was kind of a big deal. There were sexuality-based studies. This was one of them. We made Scarborough Report. We made O'Reilly. I didn't go on any of those shows, but we were quite a splash because we made headlines. And one of the things that the congressional leaders were debating, and this is after we were already funded, they were talking about taking away our funding. Things on the congressional floor were said like, who needs to do study on gay Indians? We need to study real people. I thought, wow, a microaggression, excellent data. The goal of the study was to actually look at all kinds of social, cultural, historical determinants of health and wellness for Two-Spirit communities. And we were doing qualitative work as well as quantitative work, survey research. And it was one of the first EPI studies to do this work for Two-Spirit folks and in collaboration with Two-Spirit folks. And it was a special moment for me because I'm also Two-Spirit, so having the opportunity to give back in a way that I hadn't had the opportunity to do before was compelling, and actually I felt a major responsibility. This study was led primarily by Native people and by Two-Spirit people, so this was an unusual situation for NIH anyways. We did respondent-driven sampling. For those of you who might not be familiar with that, basically we identified 6 to 8 seeds at each of the sites. The Seattle site, so we were in Seattle, San Francisco, LA, New York, Oakland, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, I think Minneapolis, Minnesota here. And we worked with identified community partners in each of these sites. And we randomly selected people from within people's networks to participate in the study. So it was a rather lengthy process to do this. And we're doing testing a methodology for sampling. I mean, it's hard enough to sample American Indians in urban settings, much less trying to get gay Indians. It's kind of like getting the red and pink needle in the haystack. It's very difficult. And we oversampled. We didn't want to exclude people who are not gay identified, who are straight identified but still in same-sex relationships. We didn't want to exclude gay identified Native people who had no interest in participating in American Indian community so much. They're primarily participating in LGBT community activities that are non-Indigenous specific. So we had to make sure we try to get all parts of our community. This just gives you an example of how we did our recruitment, and also a way we could track sexual networking, because this was also included HIV prevention in our communities. So we started out, for example, this is a Seattle site with 6 seeds. So there's the 6 red dots. Can you guys see them? Okay, the 6 seeds had were various genders, transgender, all kinds of socioeconomic status, education level. So we really tried to get a cross-section of our community. So we started with them. Then we had over 200 people at the Seattle site alone volunteer to be in the study because they heard about us and they're like, hey, I want to participate. And so we never turned down a volunteer, but we had to code them separately so we could see if their data was really different or the demographic profile was different than our respondent, driven sampling strategies. By the way, they're not. So all this work to do this other kind of strategy, we ended up with the same people basically. So there's all our volunteers. Now, these are everyone else we found out about through their networks and nominations, right? So here's all the networks. Now, can you see that? Okay, what's really intriguing about that, so what's really cool, is you can see how connected people are, right? So that red dot's connected all the way to this little blue dot way over here. We also made sure we got, let me back this up. We also made sure we got isolates. Right? Who aren't connected to the main network. Now this is, from a public health perspective, this is really important because you can see if there is not a disease in this community, a transmissible disease, that this is a great prevention opportunity because there's a lot of closed networks, a lot of opportunity to get messages out, get intervention out, prevention out quickly and disseminated well. The bad news is if something gets into the community, you can see how quickly it spreads, right? So we couldn't sample all those people, so we sampled about a third of those folks, and we made sure we did our best to, and I think we did a good job of getting a big mix of the different types of networks. So we got some of the really dense networks, and we got some of the more sparse networks. So that's an example of how we got our people in the study. The majority of people were fairly well educated. Urban samples tend to be. 53% had graduated from high school, but very poor. 3/4 of our community is living in poverty. We're talking about a household income of less than $18,000 a year in cities like New York, Seattle, San Francisco, LA. So, gender assignment at birth and how they currently identifying gender for the sample, that's a whole another lecture. But over about 51% were males, 41% females. About 25% of the sample had experienced some kind of foster care, about 14% had been adopted, and about 18% experienced boarding school. And of those who experienced boarding school, about a third had experienced some kind of physical or sexual harm while in boarding school. When we asked about their childhood trauma, and this is on the childhood trauma scale, we asked about how extreme was your sexual or physical abuse or neglect. And these are pretty high rates of people saying that they had extreme childhood trauma. So now the interesting thing here, the emotional neglect piece and emotional abuse. For our Native men, when we looked at what were predictors of homelessness for Native youth, for men as youth and as adults, what we found was it wasn't sexual and physical violence that predicted that. It was emotional abuse and emotional neglect, which was interesting. So when you layer that and you think about historical trauma and the avoidance and the disruption in intimacy and communication patterns, you can see how emotional neglect would play a critical potential role there. So now we're to our Two-Spirit women. Remember I showed you Native women in general? Two-Spirit women, highly victimized. 85% had experienced sexual assault. 85%. It's off the charts. Okay. 38% had experienced both physical and sexual assault by both strangers and family members. And that's not inconsistent. That's close to the numbers we had for the primarily heterosexual women in the other study in New York that we did. So we're getting some consistent numbers. We also asked about historical loss. What was your experience of historical loss? This is based on Les Whitbeck's scale. Losses, and these were some of the items. And I included Minnesota cohort up here, so you can see how Minnesota fared against the national Two-Spirit sample. Losses from the effects of alcoholism on our people. 86% of the people identified that as a major loss. And these are losses that they think about daily or at least every week. So that's a lot of thinking about a lot of loss. Loss of respect by children and grandchildren for elders. Loss of people through early death. Loss of culture, loss of respect for traditional ways by the children, so forth. Then we asked about historical trauma events by generation for the Two-Spirit communities. And these were some of the events: boarding school, adoption, foster care, prevention of cultural expression, exploitation of traditional homelands through things like radioactive dumping or flooding. The BIA relocation program, we specifically asked if your family felt forced or coerced into having to do that. Community massacres, land allotments stolen or taken away, medical procedures without proper informed consent, being held hostage or experienced combat that was not based on being in the military here in the United States, so forth. And then also relatives, artifacts, and remains being stolen or warehoused in museums or grave sites being desecrated. These were events that communities had I initially identified were traumatic. So then we looked at the impact on PTSD. Now, remember I said earlier, the hard thing to find out is how can you isolate historical trauma from contemporary trauma and violence in one's lifetime? How do we do that? Well, we're still trying to play with that. So this is very preliminary results I'm sharing with you. These aren't published yet, and we're still working it out. But basically, what we did is we controlled for lifetime physical and sexual violence exposure in the statistical work that we did. So we controlled for that to isolate the impact of historical trauma over generations on contemporary manifestations of PTSD. And what we found is there's a relationship. So even after controlling for physical and sexual violence, boarding school has an effect on depression. So what we found is things like dislocation or out-of-home placements, those have an effect on depression, so depressive symptoms, whereas things like exploitation of anything like a direct assault on the person or community had relationship to PTSD. And then we were interested in what kind of PTSD, what kind of the expressions, whether it was arousal, avoidance reactions, or re-experiencing PTSD symptoms. And you can see here that it's mostly arousal symptoms related to things like intergenerational trauma over land allotments being stolen or community massacres. And then again, that prevention of cultural expression is related to anxiety. So it's a consistent finding across totally two different samples. Now this is the more interesting one. So what we found is then we try to create trauma profiles. So, and this is significant for almost all the findings we had. There's a general pattern where flatter profiles, the flattening of the profile, these are across generations. Flatter profiles associated with chronic trauma through the generations is associated with poor mental health in the present generation. So this is our first attempt to try to say, can intergenerational trauma have an effect on present generation mental health? And what you'd expect is, if there was a traumatic event and it doesn't have an effect on future generations, you'd see something more like a triangle like this. But the flattening of the line shows that there's a chronicity of that intergenerational trauma that persists, that still affects mental health today. So this is some of the preliminary work that we're doing to kind of show that. So this gets to the other pieces, how does historical trauma literally become embodied, both in risk behavior and in the actual body? And the way we decided to look at two different things. One is we're looking at smoking behaviors as risk behaviors, and then also physical pain. Native people have high rates of self-reported pain, really high rates of self-reported pain, and that you can see how it's getting treated in Indian country with a lot of OxyContin these days, right? So this is actually a critical issue. How do we manage and address pain, and how is pain connected potentially to historical loss and historical intergenerational trauma? So that trauma might be actually manifest through pain reactions. So what are the implications? To give you an example, there's a historical trauma loss, and we broke it down by gender, men, women, and people who were transgendered. And you can see that women and transgender community members identify more active thoughts around historical loss than men. But still, monthly, about a third of the sample is thinking about this at least monthly, and about 25% or 15 to 25% are thinking about it daily or more. And then we also looked at discrimination distress. So how does microaggressions affect smoking and in the embodiment of pain as well? And again, women and transgender community members tend to report more distress associated with these discriminatory encounters than men. And you can see that's happening quite a bit still. High rates of smoking. This is a major issue in our community. I know it is for Minnesota Indigenous communities as well. Really high rates of smoking here, right? You guys, I think, have some of the highest rates of cancer associated with smoking, I think. So 88% of the women, lesbian and bisexual women, smoke in our sample. This is current smoking, not lifetime. Okay, and then high rates of self-reported pain, which we weren't surprised to find. At least a third of the sample says that they have moderate pain. And again, some people are living, about 7% of the women say that they're living with severe, very severe pain on a daily level. This is self-report. We asked about their micro-invalidations, their microaggressions. Here's some of the items just to give you an idea of what we asked about. There are items like how distressed are you by these or bothered by these experiences. One is being told by a non-native person that he or she was an Indian in a past life, or that grandmother was a Cherokee princess, being asked if you're a real Indian. Okay, so that's an example of a micro-invalidation. Micro-insults, these have to do with things like being accused of not doing your share of the work because you're Native, and having anything that has to do with insensitivity or demeaning identity. And then micro-assaults, being called racist names. Assumptions of criminality, being trailed or followed in a store because there's this assumption that you might steal something, those kinds of things. Out of this data came two other kinds of subscales that we didn't originally anticipate. One is a type of a micro-invalidation we're calling colonial erasure, and that's characterized by experiences that erase Indianness or indigeneity, that nullify it in some way. And those are characterized by experiences where non-natives constantly stating that you don't act or look Indian, or hearing from non-natives how surprisingly articulate or well-read you are, or hearing discussions by instructors or persons in authority about Indians as if we no longer exist. You know, those kinds of experiences. Or always starting with Indian 101 just to make a point, because you have to rewrite history every single time you have a conversation with people who aren't familiar with Native history. Micro insults. This is another one that came up. What we're calling is colonial authority. And this is a microaggression experience where it's characterized by experiences where non-natives assert colonial authority to control images of us, or to literally invade our physical space, or to assert their own authority over all things Indians. They're more of an expert about Indians than we are, about our own experience. So that's like, I think about some of the German hobbyists I used to encounter in New York City who would say, well, we're more Indian than you because we do better beadwork now than you, that kind of stuff. I was like, what? Being asked in New York City, some of the Native guys used to talk about people coming up and touching their hair, you know, so that kind of stuff. So what we found was historical loss was related to current smoking, not surprisingly. So about 3.5 times the odds of, for each unit increase in historic loss was associated with 3.5 times the odds of current smoking. And same with discrimination. Each unit increase in discrimination was associated with almost 2.5 times the odds of current smoking. And about 22% of the variance in physical pain was related to historical loss symptoms. So pain is related to historical loss. And same with discrimination. So our findings are kind of consistent with what we're proposing theoretically and what our communities are saying that they're experiencing. And identity. How does identity affect all of this? Well, interestingly, remember in the stress coping model I showed you earlier, we looked at family identity as buffering the impact of these events on our outcome. Well, what we found was that that was true. People who had high levels of positive identity attitudes, being American Indian, feeling good about who you are as a Native person, and having positive attitudes towards other Indians as a group, those folks who had experienced high levels of discrimination, it didn't affect their self-reported health at all. It literally was like a wall, stopped it from flowing through. However, if you flip it, if someone had high levels of internalized colonizing attitudes about one's group, really poor identity attitudes, it acts as a facilitator. That's where self-reported pain and self-reported health comes in. So what does that mean? Identity matters. Having a positive identity really matters. Building our programs and our family work and our work with our children, this is where work with kids really is important. Identity becomes a critical stress buffering piece in helping our children negotiate stressful situations, not just historical trauma or microaggression distress, but other kinds of stress and stressful situations. There's limitations to this data because it's cross-sectional, of course, and there's some limited generalizability. We're not sure if it necessarily would extend to rural geographic areas. And although people were recruited from the 6 cities, we were unable to perform stratified analyses due to the small number of folks. And despite, though, the existence of alternative interpretations, we do think our findings are consistent with the existing literature on the negative influence of discrimination on health outcomes. So it supports what's already out there. And it's concordant with our theoretical framework, but most importantly, it's consistent with what our communities are telling us. See, I see my role as a researcher as just being a vessel for our community. So I'm not discovering anything that we don't already know, basically. It's just providing an opportunity to demonstrate that. So in terms of implications and future directions, our findings suggest that more subtle forms of racial discrimination in the form of microaggressions have a negative health effect and should be addressed in any intervention work that we're doing. Studies have shown that stressors increasingly have direct impact on physical health through biological mechanisms, and so our findings suggest that the reported body pain and impairment may reflect the embodiment, literally embodiment of stressful events, particularly historical trauma-related losses and microaggression distress. And our results also suggest that community-level efforts to improve levels of identity among our communities may be effective in promoting health or mitigating the consequences of racial discrimination or internalized colonization. And historical or intergenerational trauma may have long-term effects across generations on mental health, in particular PTSD and depressive symptoms. So that's kind of kind of the highlight on the empirical work that we've been doing. So I'd like to turn to the remainder of our time to clinical implications and practice strategies and talk a little bit about that. So we talked about historical trauma is linked to the mental health symptom expression. So let's talk a little bit about decolonizing practice strategies. So a lot of the work in our communities talk about the effect of historical trauma is actually causes a soul wound. Okay, it's not just a psychological effect, it's not just a physical effect, it's not just the embodiment literally, but it's a soul wounding process. And that part of the work in a lot of our communities is connecting to the spiritual sides of practice as much as it is connecting to the psychological therapeutic sides of practice. That makes some people uncomfortable, but it's important to acknowledge that because from a lot of our community's points of view, that's integral to the healing process. So. One of the things that we do, and I kind of gave you an example of, is soul wound timelines with a focus on the original instructions. And I had some people ask me to clarify what I mean by original instructions at that break, if that would be helpful right now for me to do. When I talk about original instructions, all of our tribes, all of our communities have protocols and codes of conduct about how we conduct ourselves in the world, how we are expected to be a good human being, how we are expected to relate to the land and place and space, how we are expected to relate to future generations and to our ancestors. And those ways of relating and those original instructions are quite often embedded in our creation stories, our origin stories, stories that might be specific. Like, for example, I asked about what are your original instructions for how you relate to food? So there are opportunities for whatever kind of therapeutic process you might be engaging with and doing mental health work with families and children is to go back to something that's more specific. For example, right now we're doing cardiovascular disease prevention and we're working with children and families. We're doing just this kind of work now. And one of the things we're talking about is looking at using metaphors related to original instruction stories as a way to guide our process and to frame our interventions. So for example, we're talking with elders now about using, we're in the Northwest, so talking about using deception stories. There's a lot of trickster stories and deception stories about processes of deception and what we're supposed to learn about these deceivers or deceptive experiences. We're using that as a way to look at food advertising and food products in our communities. So we're integrating the deception stories that are traditional to the people with understanding how food is sold to us and how we're being deceived quite often. So that's one way to kind of bring the intervention to some of the original instructions kind of piece. Are you guys with me on that? So, and the other piece is always starting with original instructions. And like I said, even when people don't know their original instructions, it's a good question to ask because that's part of the healing process for our communities is to find out, well, how is it? What does it mean to be a good human being? What does it mean to eat well? What does it mean to conduct ourselves in certain ways? It's starting a journey for them because, as we showed the slide earlier, identity matters. So it's another way of addressing identity and beginning that healing process too, because that can be a stress buffering factor down the line. The other piece is focusing on developing communal, family, and individual interventions. So our interventions quite often have to be multi-level and multi-systemic. Even when I'm working with that individual, a parent, for example, if you're working with that parent, and for you might not have the child in with you, but you're working with just that parent, like I said, you're still working with the whole system. Even in working with that parent, you have to orient yourself to the collective piece of who are they in there with, who's in there with you. And the idea is to promote decolonizing approaches to practice that improve people's sense of wellness and their positive identity. So I'm using this term decolonizing approaches, and I just want to clarify what I mean by that. Decolonizing approach is one of the central facets of doing a decolonizing approach. It has to do with creating new narratives from which to deeply contextualize mental health, substance use. These are two major issues that go together out of the historical trauma stuff in our communities. It includes naming, reframing, creating new narratives by which to understand our relationship to these issues. And then also an emphasis on cultural protective factors for program development and innovation. I think it's really important to keep in mind that how Native people see themselves really matter in this. People who've been in the client systems and mental health systems for a really long time learn to be good clients. And part of our decolonizing work is to shake that up. I think that's good for anybody. I don't think that's just good for Indigenous people. And I actually think some of the stuff I'm going to share with you, I think you can easily see translatable for other communities we're working with. So before I go down that route, I just want to say one other caveat, that part of the work in doing historical trauma, timelines, and soul wounds and original instructions, when you do a soul wound timeline, that's a great thing to do at a community level. Working with elders in a community to find out what were the original instructions for the people, and then what were the events, the community events, historically traumatic events that happened to a particular community, and then how did the community respond? So what were the survival strategies? And then layering on top of that, then what were the family's responses, the family that you might be working with? So that creates this kind of three-dimensional way of looking at, over time, how historical trauma has impacted the community and what were the survival strategies and whether those survival strategies are still working or not. So it gives a family a chance to reflect on that. Another one is to create cultural genograms and soul wound genograms. You can actually, so for example, if you want to look at violence in a particular family, one of the great questions to ask is, where did you learn that? Because that's not part of our original instructions. Beating our children is not part of our original instructions, right? That's not cultural. So one of the first things to do is you ask, well, where did we learn this behavior? Where did that come from? And then you start doing you do a cultural genogram on the soul wound timeline through the generations. I can almost guarantee you're going to get to boarding school. And it gives a whole different way for the family to view themselves. It gives them a different way to create new narratives from which to heal. It gives them a different way of relating to violence, literally to relating to the spirit of violence. How are we going to relate to it in a way that's going to be about healing and not about becoming violent or becoming this entity, but rather let's take this violence outside, let's look at it, let's have a relationship to it. So decolonizing practice is about reestablishing relationships. That's a critical component. Because what does colonization do? It disrupts relationships. It disrupts relationship to land. It disrupts relationships to each other. It disrupts relationships to our bodies, right? I think part of the problem with pain for our communities is we have such high pain tolerance that we don't seek help, in part because the colonization becomes embodied. So decolonizing approaches is to reconnect and reestablish these relationships. That's relationships to self, body, mind, spirit, culture, community, history. So it's reestablishing those relationships. That's critical. Okay. So that involves, finding out. The other piece is colonization also does something else. When colonization happens, it requires the nation state to become dependent on the colonizer for its goods, products, services, all those kinds of things. Well, think about that in terms of the impact on our families and individuals. That part of undoing colonization is to break cycles of dependency, of having others tell us who we are, having others tell us how to create our own boundaries. So creating our own boundaries, creating new relationships, and creating a better understanding of those relationships is critical. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in more detail. So some of the practice-based strategy, are you guys with me? Any questions on that so far? Anything I need to address? I'll get more into some of those things, but the relational piece is really critical. I'll give you one example of the relational piece that I think might help illustrate. Eduardo Duran, and some of this is from the work of Eduardo Duran's Healing the Soul Wound. And Eduardo is somebody who I'd been influenced by because he also was, when I did clinical practice, he was one of my mentors and somebody I consulted with frequently. He gives a great example of a decolonizing approach to practice about clients becoming good clients and how to undo that and shake it up a little bit. Imagine a client who walks into the room and, it's a mental health system, and you're working in a mental health system. And you ask that client, and let's picture an adult client, a parent. You say, who are you? Now, someone who's been in the system really a long time will maybe say, I'm depressed, right? And then Ed will shake it up a little bit by saying, well, is that what your mother named you? Oh, no. So right away, getting back to naming and the power of naming. So interjecting something more than just shaking it up, but actually back to how do we originally introduce ourselves as Indigenous people, right? But also the power of naming, because he's about to introduce the fact that this person's been in a naming ceremony, they didn't even know it. So he'll say that. He might say something like, do you know, you've been part of a naming ceremony. You've just told me your name is depressed. And the person's like, okay, you're getting really far out. What do you mean? So he does that to shake it up a little bit. And why is that important? Naming in Indigenous communities and cultures is very powerful. And it's powerful in a lot of our cultures that we come from. Naming in many of our communities, I mean, we each of our tribes have our own protocols for naming ceremonies. But quite often what naming does is it establishes a way the community relates to you. It establishes protocols by which you conduct yourself. It establishes certain expectations by which you live up to that name. So he'll shake it up by saying, you've been part of a naming ceremony. You know, there was these healers who all got together and they wear these white coats and then they create this book called a DSM. And so they took your name from that book and they gave it to you. Do you know that? And so then we say, well, let's look at that. Because when people in physical health conditions don't generally say, I'm cancer, unless that's their zodiac sign, right? But we're starting to see it in physical health now, right? I'm alcoholic, I'm diabetic. Now I become the disorder. As opposed to, I have a relationship to diabetes. This is the relational piece. I have a relationship to the spirit of sadness, my depression. I have a relationship to, so part of decolonizing practice is establishing a relationship to these as almost as spiritual entities. I'm going to go, for some of you who are not comfortable with that, you don't have to go there, but for those of you who are comfortable with it, go there with me for a minute. But the idea is that these are entities that we can have a relationship to and a relationship with. And for some of us, we've had a long relationship with alcohol. We've had a long relationship with depression or PTSD or whatever it is. So what it does is it gives us a new narrative, a new way of relating to this mental health condition in a way that allows it to take it outside of us and say, okay, now I have a relationship. Now, if I form a relationship with something, that means we're going to set boundaries and protocols with each other. I'm going to find a way to relate to this spirit of sadness, that we honor each other. So it's a whole different way of looking at it than I'm depressed. And it doesn't mean, that doesn't discredit or take away from neurological, biological, other kind of mechanisms that might be going on. But what it does is it gives people an opportunity to reestablish the boundaries and relationships that have been stripped. And also establish the fact that they're in a naming ceremony and they get to create a new name for themselves and a new way of relating if they so choose. So that's one of the things that we talk about. The other is, on a community level, is community memorialization processes. This is a great site of resistance as well as healing. And we see a lot of examples of that here with community memorial walks, recognizing the relocations here that happen, as well as the Bigfoot Memorial Ride up in South Dakota. We have a memorial walk on the Trail of Tears in my tribe every year. And a lot of people tend to pathologize that and worry that why are we going on and on about this? And well, these become sites of resistance as also sites of healing for a lot of our communities by having the recognition be in place. So the other piece is tribal justice and healing systems needing to work together, especially in issues of family violence, that this is really critical. I talked a little bit earlier about distinguishing between colonial trauma response and original instructions. I'll give you another example from the African American community that Joy Leary has shared with other folks, which I think is a powerful example. About this coping mechanisms that our communities might do that we sometimes call cultural, but again, it really might be linked to this historical trauma. She gives a great example of an African American woman, descendant of slaves, who's talking to a white friend of hers, and they're both picking up their kids from preschool. And The African-American mom says to the white mom, gee, your little Henry, he seems to be doing great at school. And the mom says, thank you, I really appreciate that. And your little Johnny, he's doing great too. And then the African-American mom says to her, oh no, he's a big pain, he gives me a hard time. And Johnny's over there listening to this going, what's going on? And so Joy usually asks the African-American women, does she love her son? And they're like, of course she loves her son. So why is she doing that? And so the women quite often will say things like, cultural survival strategies, he's got to, it's a hard world out there, and they come up with all kinds of explanations. She said, well, let's imagine this. Plantation days, and there's mom in the fields, and there's the master who comes up to her and says to her, boy, Johnny sure looks good. And what does she say? Oh no, he's no good, he's not, okay. So Joy's doing some of the work in African American communities of trying to kind of connect to why we do some of the cultural survival responses that we do. That's out of love and out of caring for our communities, but we have an opportunity to rethink how we do some of these things in ways that might be more healing and helpful. Because Johnny doesn't know, Johnny has no understanding of that. Johnny just knows mom's not saying anything. Henry's mom just said something positive. How come my mom's not saying positive, right? So some of that is honoring. And this is important to do. You have to honor why these things are in place first before we begin to shift them. Because if we don't, you're going to get cultural resistance, because people then think you're mucking around with their cultural survival. So there's a way, remember I told you about the example with the elder ladies, the importance of me first hearing their story and honoring it, and then introducing the original instructions and then saying, when did these disruptions occur? That's a way to address some of that. So we have these renaming ceremonies. Another element that we haven't talked about is returning secrets to the sacred and returning silence to the sacred. Part of the dysfunction in some of all of our communities, it has to do with this notion of secrets, especially secrets around sexual violence. And, I think there's something about the value of being silent that's cultural, that's part of a lot of our communities, but disentangling the silence when silence is part of natural cultural conditions versus a way of not talking about something that is dysfunctional is part of what needs to be disentangled there. In our society, a lot of our tribes have secret societies. We have a lot of rules around secrets. So returning secrets to the sacred as opposed to having it being a colonial trauma response or a sexual trauma response is something, again, to disentangle. The relational restoration and healing of disruptions. Some of our tribes are doing things like doing traditional ceremonies, like among the Lakota, the wiping the tears ceremony is a way to heal from some of these things. And then finally, there's some exercises that you can do as practitioners, working with other practitioners to deal with vicarious trauma and hearing these historically traumatic stories. You guys might want to do this today. If I had all the rocks and flowers, I'd give them to you. But I'll just tell you what this exercise is like, because I think it's a great exercise. I've done it with clinicians, and I've done it with students. And you can even do it with families, I imagine. But basically what you do is you go to a stream or go to a beach and pick rocks, hands about the size of your fists, all kinds of shapes, sizes, and stuff. And I have about 20 students in my class I just did this week with. So I went and I picked these rocks out. Then I picked plants out too, little small plants, same number of plants to rocks. And I cover them up and I bring them in. And then we sit in a circle. And so the students don't know what's there, or your practitioners won't know what's there. And this is great for self-care. This is a good exercise for self-care in dealing with trauma. I ask them, I turn down the lights, I light a candle as a point of visualization for them, and we do a little meditation, a little deep breathing, relaxation to get them in tune with their body. And then I ask them that we're going to do an exercise where we're going to honor the burden of the stories, to honor all the stories that you carry and you've been carrying and you've been hearing in your practice around trauma, historical trauma, even the stories of your own family and generations that these are major stories that you've been carrying, and there's a weight of those stories, and you're carrying that probably somewhere in your body. So I ask them to visualize where in your body are you carrying it. And we do a whole visualization around that. Eventually I have them take it out of wherever it's at, and I ask them to visualize it going down their arm, their left arm, because that's connected to their heart, and that they're going to hold it in their palm. And I ask them to visualize that, and they sit there just with their palm open, imagining the weight of that. And I acknowledge that in this honoring of those stories, we're transforming the relationship. Again, the relationship. We're transforming the relationship to this trauma, so that you're no longer carrying it, but you're still honoring it. And you're taking it outside of yourself, and you're going to hold it in the weight of your hand. Then I uncover the rocks, and I say, go pick a rock. Go pick a rock. That represents the weight that you're carrying. And they take that rock, and they sit with it. And then I do another meditation where they sit with it for a little bit. I play a song. For those of you who are interested, I play Eulalie, All My Relations. It's a great song because it talks about the complexity in having compassion for the people who've perpetrated against us, and that we ourselves have been perpetrators at times too. So dealing with the complexity of healing from any kind of trauma, historical trauma. And then afterwards, they talk a little bit about their rock. Some students, for example, said this, they'll say things, I notice I'm holding my rock under my desk, I don't even want to look at it. Others will say, my rock has like scars on it. That makes me think about the scars the wounds that have healed over, that I've carried. Another one will say, there are holes in mine, but I can accept those holes. It was interesting. So it becomes a metaphor. Using metaphors is really powerful for Indigenous people. This becomes a metaphor. Then I ask them if they're ready, and when they're ready, to please replace those rocks with a flower, because they're transforming it from the burden of the weight that they're carrying to something that's life-giving. So from an Indigenous perspective, you don't just throw away these energies. You don't just throw something. People say, even sweat lodges say, just give it to the rocks. I'm like, well, no, you're doing more than that. It's about transforming. It's about transforming. So part of the work is you don't just throw away the negative energy, because then what happens? You got a duck, it's going to come back. So part of it is transforming it. So I say now it's a chance to transform it with the flowers, that you have an opportunity to water this, give life back. And some students don't want to get rid of their rocks. And I said, okay, you can hold your rocks if you want, but you have a different relationship to it, and you have to recognize that it's a different relationship if you're going to keep it. Yeah, so I said, you can have a rock and a flower if you want, but just know it's a different relationship now. You've transformed it. So then, of course, everyone wants to know, what am I going to do with our rocks if they give it back to me? And so I put it back to the water. And one of the things I talk about is the water with those flowers. That water is our first medicine. And so literally we're returning it back to our first medicines to cleanse and have life-giving. So when you water those plants, you're still honoring your ancestors, and you're still honoring all those stories you carried, but now it's life-giving. So anyways, that was based on an exercise that was done in a counseling psych program. It's online. I'm blanking on right now on the colleagues who did that. But if you look up compassion fatigue and on PsychLit, Psych Info, you'll be able to get that exercise. I transformed it into what we do, but I think it's a good exercise. So those are some of the things that we can do to actually transform it. And then, of course, I've talked about recognizing violence as an historical inheritance. Part of that is to move away from this defective Indian idea to a historical perspective to understand. So that's that renaming. It's important to learn about pre-colonial history if you're going to do work in Indigenous communities, because our history doesn't begin with the violence. Our history begins with those original instructions. Reinterpreting mistrust is a healthy reaction to historical trauma. That's part of the reaction. And we talked a little bit about documentation. In terms of work with families, working about communicating around historical trauma, assisting family members in exploring losses and making links to current family functioning. And I talked a little bit about that, and identifying resilience in that. Reframing relationships with sickness and medicines to treat. Remember, from an Indigenous perspective, the problem is a lot of our data out there and a lot of our models are based on, the idea is to get rid of this depression. Everything's based on this notion of absence of psychopathology, but we don't have a clear sense of what we're replacing it with. It's a presence of wellness. So from an Indigenous perspective, what does wellness look like? What does transcending the trauma look like? What does that really mean? We did body sculpting in my historical trauma class on this, and students got stymied. They're like, well, what does wellness look like? Because we don't spend enough time on saying, well, what are we moving to? We're not moving to the absence of something, but we're returning to wellness. What does that look like? And then reestablishing protocols and offerings, that's also part of the relational model and decolonizing practice. I don't have too much time to get into that right now. Oops, going the wrong direction. I'm like, hey, I've seen that. Here's an example of the Bigfoot Memorial Ride, our long walk commemoration for the community level stuff. This is an example of the humane immigrant rights murals. Murals are very powerful. They're a great tool for youth. If you want youth to get in touch with trying to understand their own soul wound timelines and historical traumas, have them do a mural. They'll tell the story, and that becomes another way of talking about raising historical critical consciousness in communities. And this is one from Ireland, Northern Ireland. So I just wanted to kind of end with some instructions. Someone wrote down, paraphrasing an original instruction from White Buffalo Calf Woman. When one sits in the hoop of the people, one must be responsible because all of creation is related. And the hurt of one is the hurt of all. And the honor of one is the honor of all. And whatever we do affects everything in the universe. If you do it that way, that is, if you truly join your heart and mind as one, whatever you ask for, that's the way it's going to be. And I just want to emphasize that, I've talked a lot about, I haven't talked much about internalized lateral oppression, how we hurt each other as Indigenous people as a manifestation of the historical trauma, but that's another layer here as well that's really critical. And I also want to acknowledge that our healing is directly connected to the healing of all people. And that, so our allies in this, our non-Indigenous allies who've joined us on this journey to try to help do this, part of the work is to do your own decolonizing work with us and join us in that struggle so that we can begin to move forward and heal together. So, thank you.
Which of you would like to begin? They're fighting over it.
Yeah, he pulled rank on me. My name is Jessica Gorno, and I am the Healing Generations Therapist at the American Indian Family Center in the east side of St. Paul. I am from the Turtle Mountain Band of, well, the government calls it Chippewa. I prefer to call myself a Ojibwe. And I lived there most of my life. My parents were part of the BIA relocation program at that time, and ended up in San Francisco, California for a short period of time. And I was born there, but we went back to the reservation at a very young age. Ended up at University of North Dakota, Grand Forks, and then matriculated here to Hennepin County Medical Center. Just because that was when I sat down with my family. They said, you're allowed to go to these 3 states. You can't go any farther. So Minnesota was one of them. So I've been here ever since 1998. And luckily got into touch with some fine individuals at the American Indian Family Center, and they wanted to add a mental health component, which is very, very new for Native people. It's not usually the way we receive help, especially with the stigma in the general population. It's much higher in the American Indian population with going with that. So I've been with them since the 2000. My primary, because of the things that I've learned or been involved with, I've worked on all the Indian reservations in the state of North Dakota. Most of my experience before I came to the cities was with rural populations, reservation population schools, so a lot of my work is with children. At the Family Center, I work a lot with women who experience high rates of trauma, and we focus generally on trauma work, women and children. I don't get very many men coming in, so really trying to blend all perspectives. And I guess one of the things that probably hit home the most when Karina was talking is that the way I was brought up on the reservation is everything was kind of told in stories, and if you didn't get the story, you weren't learning the lesson. And so as she was talking, all I got were these feelings of my grandmother and my father telling me these stories, and I realized, that was how we learned. And as Indian people, and especially in therapy, when I conceptualized that, I immediately start talking when people come in. I said, well, why don't you tell me your story? they get that. If I can start with, tell me your story. What's your story? Everybody's got a story. The other thing with working with Native people is, as a therapist, the Western perspective is you have the professional and you have the client coming in. And it's a very imbalanced system and is very uncomfortable, especially for Native people, because we're very colonized. And I know what over here, for instance, when I came here today, I was nervous. I work in a Native organization. I've gotten very comfortable with being Native and not getting in trouble for the things I say. And I had to go back to my days. No, remember HCMC and how you act. You're going to be around white people. You have to act a particular way. And it's kind of how you grow up, and you're able to switch back and forth quite easily. But when you work as a Native person, and you have to kind of get through that barrier with your client when they come in, you're not meeting the true Native person. You're meeting the person they think that you want, that you're asking them to be. So there's a lot of, I'm here with you on a journey. I'm not this professional. I don't come in dressed up. I mean, the worst thing I could do is walk into the family center. I used to come in suits, pinstripes, all excited, Oh, I'm going to cure everybody. And I was like, why are people so afraid of me? And finally, one of the ladies who was our great elder, she was telling me stories. She said, they're scared of you because you're dressed like a white woman. And what she meant by that is you can dress in a way but you have to come down to people's levels, and it sets them off balance. So I got really good at, it's like, okay, I got to change this up. I can't do this. But in grad school, I'd been so, in the mainstream culture, they start telling you, develop your professional wardrobe. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And so I started doing that, but by the time I got to working, you couldn't do that with Native people. So there's a lot of normalizing and being there with them on a journey. You talk about a journey because you're growing with them. And you're learning as you go with this person. I do a lot of that. The other issues, as I always go, is I'm never working with the individual. One of the topics that Karina brought up is you're not working with just that person who walked into your office. With a Native person, you're looking at many people who may not be sitting in the room. Usually most of the time, if it's matrilineal, and you have to be careful, but a lot of Native societies, even if you think that they're patriarchal, it's the women who are the grandmas, the mothers, the aunties who are running the show. And it's very important to know who that person is in the family. There's always one or two. And when you're looking for buy-in to try to help work with somebody, it's oftentimes, who's the person in your life that you look to for advice? And we go from there. That's usually your person that you really want to bring into the room a lot. I bring in everybody, but it's that one person. And it's usually you can get that from their story when they're telling stories, traditional stories. If they don't know their stories, we figure that out. We create new stories. The other issue that she brought up is we're very narrative. We're very visual people. And we understand that way of learning. I try not to use too many DSM terms. I only use the DSM terms when I have to diagnose something for insurance. Or when I try to explain to them as a way of explaining. I use the term PTSD, but I explain it from a Native perspective and how it is transmuted. And a lot of times Natives get, when you talk about, how we carry things in our body? Where do you feel that? And we start talking about it that way. And then we bring the medicine wheel in. I never do therapy without talking about the spiritual aspect. If you're working with Native people, and I think it's with all people, I don't necessarily think that's just an Indigenous issue. And I'm very careful with that because not all Native people with all the colonization are traditional according to what mainstream culture would deem as traditional. Some have really accepted or enfolded the Christianity portion of their existence. What I'm really concerned with is seeing where they're at in that process. But when we look at it, like when we do treatment plans, I put everything in the medicine wheel. We talk about what makes everybody whole, and I make it very visual because they understand that. And when they understand what's going on, they're willing to work with you more often. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Am I okay? One more minute? Okay. So there were many things that spoke to me with Karina's talks, but those were just some of the main topics that I had. I haven't touched on a lot, but I think I'll just leave it open for questions. Thank you.
I am blessed today because I have a former student who's a very accomplished gentleman sitting out there, Mr. John Poupart. And over the years, John and I have become very close. We are like brothers. We share our same way, and we carry his spirit with us wherever we go. I wish I could say the same thing after listening to Karina about her, because while I convinced her to go to the doctoral program, I abandoned her as a professor by coming back to Minnesota. And I sat there all presentation. I said, damn, why couldn't I just say, this is my former student? As any academic would love to do. I would like to touch on just a few things, and I don't have any critical comments as much as sharing the strengths and trying to shift a few things. Karina is really a personification of the second generation American Indian academic. My generation, we're trying to make inroads in the institution of higher learning with the markers of identity: land, language, religion, family, and the sense of peoplehood. And much of that was covered today as historic trauma, because that's the way we framed it. But I want you, that lets you off too easy, much too easy, because historic trauma, much in the name or much akin to what the, God, I'm going to say this publicly, the former coach of the Washington Redskins, Mr. Allen, used to say, history is now. Every one of you who attend the University of Minnesota, who work for the University of Minnesota, without acknowledging Minnesota's support for Mount Graham, is involved in trauma, because you've taken the sacred mountain of the Tohono O'odham, of the Fort McDowell Apache, of the San Carlos Apache, and you've desecrated it. Every one of you who is affiliated in any way with anthropological archaeology, and who abuse the concept of repatriation are guilty of historic trauma. Every one of you who work in the field of social work and strip a child, much as Pratt would strip a child from Indian families, are guilty of historic trauma. Because you've taken that child or that religion and you've stripped it from our marker of identity. So it's not simply history we're talking about the here and now. And everything that Karina says is appropriate in that vein as well as in the past. So don't walk out of here relieved that you didn't do any of this, because you have, unless you're Indian. And I think you've been with me in most of that. Your toes getting pretty tired about kicking people, but it occurs. The second thing, and this is probably the most critical, I don't know, I think John was probably doing the same thing, but we were trying to deal with this issue of original instructions. See, my generation didn't grow up with the term original instructions. These are traditions. These are institutions. These are the founder, the centerpiece of our identity. I'm a member of a big drum. We have several members on that drum, and each of us has a function in our community. I have a name. And John has a name, and each of us carry the spirit of that name. So that when I talk about the trauma, we do have the wiping away of the tears ceremonies. But we also have so many ceremonies all the way through life. Ron Lewis and I used to talk, we used to get confused by Erik Erikson's teenage stuff. Because, we'd sit down and we'd say, one day we were children, the next day we were adults, because we went through a ceremony. And most tribal people do this. Even Jewish people go through bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah, and they begin to be treated as adults. Ours was a little different. We were adults. And I started working and helping to support my family, because that was an obligation. The second thing, or the third thing, is that as professionals, we learn that we are the super healer. I remember that in Indian Way, Julie Shingaby from Eastlake was my mother-in-law, and she used to always tell me that you cannot heal an Indian in secret. If you're working with a community, an individual is part of that community, and you don't have what we call the professional injunction of privacy. Most of our good work comes out of a communal experience, and that's not unusual. I remember when my son almost died, that he was healed, but the entire community of Eastlake knew he was ill. So it's something that what Karina says goes well beyond where we are in terms of Indian and white, because, and well beyond the stereotypes, in the sense that we have a lot of things. I don't ask you to take away my depression. Hell, I've been depressed for 73 years, and I've learned to live with it. But what I ask you to do is to walk out and respect what Karina has talked about, whether you call them original instructions, tradition, whether you call it the identity factors of land, religion, family. Whatever you walk out with, don't try to take away my sadness, just respect the next generation down the line and the generation after that. And I think Karina really gave an eye-opener today, and I'd like to just ask you, just give her a hand.
At this point, I think we're ready to entertain questions.
I don't do Q of A, so I'll leave that.
Oh, no way. Tie him down.
I'm just kidding.
We have a questioner back here.
My name's Warren Taylor. I'm from a public school district in Cottage Grove, Woodbury, Newport, St. Paul Park area of the Twin Cities. And my question is, how would you advise someone like myself, a young, white, male, American, heterosexual, all sorts of privileges that come along with that, to bring these things back to the very, very hidden cultural trauma that exists in the dominant culture? Because there's so much that exists in the school district where I work that needs to happen with the people who look like me and sound like me in order to change from within the system that exists, to help ourselves acknowledge these things before we can even go somewhere to change our system to acknowledge what might need to be there for other races and ethnicities. It's when I've heard Tim Wise, a white anti-racist, talk about this, he talks about this almost as having to do it from a selfish perspective for ourselves. I my question is, how do you feel about someone like me going to my own community to do this? Is that as important to you as trying to understand from within Indigenous cultural perspectives how to interact with your background and your groups to advocate for you within my system? Because I see a definite bridge that needs to happen, but do you think these ideas that you brought today of historical trauma versus daily microaggressions and this decolonizing, how do I go about doing that with my own people? Does that make any sense?
That's a hard one.
I'll take a stab at this. It's a good question for me because I've never really bothered myself with middle class angst. You know, it's like, just respect us. But I think it's a legitimate question in the sense that I think you got to take Karina's message back to your students, back to your faculty, not as an expert, but as a person who has been exposed. And I think that you got to leave it to Indians, really, to settle a lot of this stuff, a lot of the turmoil that's there, and a lot of the trauma that's there. Because I think the one thing that probably didn't escape people from a funny aspect, but the idea about don't send a skinny white woman, that's true in our communities. That's really true in our communities. I remember, I'll tell you, my generation grew up with Indian paranoia. And we thought that if you weren't paranoid, you really weren't Indian. I mean, you look around what the situation was. And I experienced some of that from the other side when I went back to get my doctorate. And I had a demonstration project at Little Earth Housing. And for 6 months, friends of mine that I had worked with for several years were sort of avoiding me because they thought with my getting a doctoral degree, I was going to study them. Yeah, when they finally figured out that I wasn't going to study them, they had a naming feast for my program. And it worked well. But we've got two different tracks going in that way. But I do think you have to take this message back. Not as an expert, but as an observer.
I think if you speak from your heart, if you kind of take the medicine ball, you can infect them like a virus. If you make them interested enough and talk about how it affected you, they might be more willing to start to learn more about that. I mean, that's the only way we start to think about changing we grow up in the way that we're brought up, whichever, if it's Caucasian, American Indian, whatever minority group you might be a part of, we grow up that way, and we tend not to look too far outside that circle until somebody lights a spark under us. And that's generally, at least for me, what has gotten me excited about the things I've happened to get into. I mean, I think if you go in and you're passionate about it and you feel strongly about it, somebody might pick up on that, and that might light a fire.
I would just add that, it's a personal journey as much as a journey for you to take it back to everyone else, and the work begins with you. And becoming more and more aware of the privileges and how that's connected to colonization and not just racism. And I think that's a piece that's missing in the anti-racist movement, that direct link to imperialism and colonialism on the back of Indigenous people. And I think just beginning to open up those doors in those environments for those kinds of ways of looking at things, and then also for your own journey to recognize that you bear the burden now that you have knowledge to do something about it. So, good luck. Have a good one.
Yeah.
Another question?
Hello. I am a children's mental health case manager for Hennepin County. And I've had the actually pleasure of working with two Indian families and their children. And they taught me quite a bit by working with them. Both of them, though, were in the suburbs, and they were highly isolated. And I know that you spoke of isolation. And scared to go into Minneapolis for the resources. Actually, one family flew to Arizona for healing. My question as a worker, just to get some guidance of how would I be able to talk to them and coming back to Minneapolis, or just for the resource part of it, you know, so that I know there was some fear of retaliation from men. There was a lot of domestic abuse involved, but yet in both families, there were male children. And I was really lost finding resources to assist the male children who wanted to go back to their reservations, actually. And actually, one family went to Luck, Wisconsin to stay with grandfather, so that was kind of like a happy ending right there. But the other family is still in isolation. Now, I had to close the case because of non-cooperation, but I still think of them often. So just something to kind of assist me if I have families like this in the future.
I'll just give you the little bit that I know. The reason you probably got non-compliance is because they were too fearful. They weren't in their community. And you need to get them into a community. And I don't know if you can do that. You need to have a contact in the Indian community, some outreach to those organizations, and then you need to bring them there. They refused.
Yeah, I would agree, but it's not my. You know, sometimes we have to look at interventions not from the standpoint of how they help, but how they hurt. And if I'm afraid of an environment, I don't want somebody talking me to come back into it without some kind of heroic type of intervention and support. But I think she was absolutely right that so many people have called me to give a hand, but they won't meet, I'll use Karina's term of original instructions. You know, when I start saying, well, what's their name? What community are they from? What tribe are they from? What little village are they from? Because the more I know about that, the more I can talk about how we can help. They drop the phone. Even former students say, I can't do that, and they go on. But I'd say if you worked with her on some of these issues and just partnered, that'd be a logical way to go.
I wanted to clarify one quick thing about how I was using original instructions and the notion of traditions and traditionality too. The way I kind of think about it is I think they're obviously connected, but I think, the best way I can explain it for how I understand it for myself is, we have spiritualists and we have ceremonialists. And spiritualists are people who know the power and know how to work with the power, and they know how to do the ceremonies and traditions. Ceremonialists may or may not know the power, but they know how to run the ceremony really good. And that's how I think about original instructions and traditionalists and the traditions. That there are people who may know their traditions, but they may not know the original instructions and the meaning behind some of the traditions they do. But people who are really traditional do know that. So when you ask for original instructions, that kind of gets more to the asking for the original spiritual elements, and then the behaviors, the protocols, and all that is about, for me, the traditional conduct and how you conduct yourself and stuff. So I just wanted to, for me, I think it's important to make, that's how I think about it. And so I didn't want people to walk away thinking that they're separate or they're different but they're connected, but they are slightly, for people who don't know their traditions anymore, starting with the original instructions is going back to the spirit part of it.
Yeah, they really are complementary,
Yeah.
the way you explain it there. And there's a difference. We made our crossover from primarily reservation rural around 1973, 74, somewhere around there. The 1970 census really pointed to it. And now, what did you say? It's 67%?
Yeah, like over 60%.
And I think that dichotomy that you laid out is going to be very important for forthcoming generations.
Yeah, that's a future generation issue, I think.
I just wanted to follow up on the case manager's question. She's describing a family that I'm guessing has chosen to isolate themselves from the community partially or maybe even largely because of fear. And I'm wondering if those of you who if you've worked with families who are choosing isolation and what your understanding is about that and what intervention might be.
I think it would be really helpful for two things. One is are they tribally connected to this community, or are they from another tribal region? You don't have to tell me where.
They're connected
Okay.
to this region.
Okay, there's two issues that come up for me when you were telling your story. One is the moccasin telegraph runs wide and deep. And if families are worried about history and worried about gossip, not that we gossip, but that's a real issue. And if there's domestic violence as part of that, that's another layer that's really prickly that we haven't really done a great job of dealing with in our communities. So that's an important element to kind of think through, because it's not that they might not want to get connected culturally to a particular person, or there might be somebody who could be helpful, but it may be this dynamic in the community here that's, for survival reasons, they're not connecting to. The other piece is then, if you do more of a historical trauma perspective, is to say, what were the family survival strategies that are being used here? How has that worked in the past? Isolation may have been a strategy. A big strategy my grandpa taught me was, which is connected to, a lot of these cultural survival strategies are rooted in actual cultural protocols, but they're manifest in different ways in these urban settings or these different kind of environments. And my grandpa taught me, and I swear this was a historical trauma response strategy too, and a cultural one. Culturally, there's a value for you be quiet until you get to know whoever you're around, and you observe and don't bring attention to yourself. So I remember starting kindergarten, and I took that to the full extreme. I pretended like no one could see me. I was really I tried not to be noticed at all. I was so shy. They brought the dang school psychologist in. But that was a survival strategy, and that was a good survival strategy if you're hiding out in the brush and you don't want the cavalry to get you or anything else. So you need to find out what were the family's survival strategies that also might be playing out here that they're not even thinking about, and that there may be other alternatives here other than complete isolation. So there's just some things off the top of my head.
That's really how the clash of institutions really go. I was thinking of my son when she was talking about her kindergarten experience, and my son in the first grade, they kept calling him John, and he wouldn't respond. He'd just be sitting in his chair and be looking around, and they would say John and John and John. And so I went down to school. I used to pick him up and went in to get him, and they said, you know your son is hard of hearing? and I said, no, he's not hard of hearing. Well, we keep calling him John. And then it dawned on me, because I was a contributor to this too, but for all of his life, before he walked into that classroom, he was Nawageesis. We just, in the family, called him his Indian name. So he didn't know anything except geese. So when they called him John, he was wondering, who's John? But it's a trauma that's not, it's every day. Yeah, it's just.
Yeah, our school systems, it's really critical. I was put in English as a second language class in first grade. And I thought, cool, English is going to be my second language. I was there for 2 weeks. And I was like, gosh, what are we doing? I finally told my parents, and they had to go marching back into the school. In part because I got tracked because I was part of the, those American Indian Ed, the first wave of American Indian Ed. And so I started getting tracked that way. So that's one of the things in schools you can look out for. But we have a ton of these stories in schools.
Do we have any questions from, before we go to another question in the audience, do we have any questions from the people, TV viewers? Not yet, okay. Okay.
Hello. I first of all wanted to say thank you for all the information and the important work that's been gathered thus far. And my name is Bob Clanrood. I work with the Division of Indian Work on Lake Street. It's not Works, it's Indian Work. And we work in direct services for Native families. We have parenting groups. I work with a program called Strengthening Family Circles, and we've recently restructured and renamed that programming. It used to be called Teen Indian Parent Program, and because that's where a lot of the funding came from, was to provide services for teen Native parents. And our client base has shifted a lot now to the early 20s. And the teen pregnancy problem in the Native community is still a huge problem that we deal with daily. But I wanted to thank the work of these people, and before everybody bails out, thank everybody for sitting here as a Native man, and I watch you and I look at you, and I come here and I see the response of the people. And it's important to me as a Native man, as a father. I work, this is the 4th year with a father's group at the Division of Indian Work. My director, or my coordinator, Nigel Parat, is here as well, and he works with different programming. Not to plug that, but just to say, the direct services for the Native community is very minimal and almost non-existent. And as a Native male, I've been riding on a grant that's been out, and they've been trying to find pockets of money to provide funding for the father group I have that I help facilitate, and I help facilitate anger management for Native males, which is huge. The waiting list is long, and this term of historic trauma is such an answer to the prayer of a lot of our people that we could be recognized with something rather than just, oh, another Indian whining around about this or that, and all those Indians are so sensitive, and those men are so thin-skinned and sensitive, why can't they accept that we're honoring them with a tomahawk chop, or, but just to break it down a little farther, I'm just a facilitator for a group because I'm compassionately motivated to be there for the young men that are coming up in this world, and that historic trauma casts a new light on the existing condition and the social miasm that we're in as far as the development of our youth, and that to coin a phrase or to give a determination of PTSD is one thing, but to really understand the multifaceted, debilitating effect of post-traumatic stress syndrome. I've been diagnosed with that in my life, and I've come forward with depression, 32 years away from an alcoholic episode, and that it's very debilitating. It's a determination, but what does it look like in the life of a person to where you feel lower than a snake's belly or less than human and unable to function? Well, why can't you just get a grip on that and go get a therapist and get some help? It's so ingrained in our social fiber and everything. I'm so glad that these reports are coming out and the demographic tools are on the radar screen now. I'm really angst at the fact that Native men always step back. Let the women and children get the funding and the money. The only programs out there are pretty much for women and children. Native men will always step back. Well, why are Native men so shy? They always have their head down, and what's wrong with them? Well, now you can kind of see why. But as Native men, we're respectful and there's a place on our head. If we put our head down and your words fall on that, that's respectful. It's not out of shyness. But I tell the men, the young guys, stand up. Tell them what services you need. If you're a single parent and you have a child who's blind and you need services, how to find culturally specific services and why they are so important. That I advocate for Native men in that direct services are very important for the woman, the child, and the male as well. And that this generation of children or young people coming up now have many more debilitating diseases such as fetal alcohol syndrome, ADHD, and if you know the demographics, it might be a little more shocking than people realize. But Native men have never been on the demographic radar as far as direct services. So I'm very grateful that they're measuring and quantitating those ideas as far as the services needed and the federal government's willingness to hand out funding towards those services that are needed. In order for us to have healthy families, healthy marriages, we need to have healthy men as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I remember my my wife started one of the early pregnancy prevention programs in Minneapolis, and she had 6 girls that she worked with very closely, and a couple of others that were involved. And as fate would have it, every one of them got pregnant. So she swiftly segued into a parenting program. And she would involve the grandparents of the children and the original instructions. And those are some of the best parents in Indian country today. But you can't abandon, if you're working with our community, you've got to be flexible and flow with the tide, I guess, is the best way to put it. But always look for the lotus out of that mud.
Another question?
We have one here from Greater Minnesota.
Okay.
Thank you for this discussion. It seems that if we take this from this racism to colonization, we must also address the issue of international adoption. I believe your same principles for healing are required, and we have some responsibility for the healing and restoration of all peoples. What are the next steps in restoration with all peoples? That's from Mankato.
We had our own enemy. We called it ARENA, the Adoption Resource Exchange of North America, which was another historic trauma bit out of from the 50s up to the middle 70s. We finally got an apology. It was funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You know, when I talk about paranoia, you know when the Bureau starts stripping you like that. And it was run by the Child Welfare League of America. And we finally got an apology a few years back from the Child Welfare League of America, although they keep stripping us of our children, you know, under ICWA rules, and still stripping us of our children. But they used to adopt kids from Canada and place them in the United States, and adopt kids from America and place them with Canadian families. And it was a deadly, destructive thing when you look at the ego identity of children. Earlier this month, I was at Mille Lacs at a conference. I met a young lady who the family had been looking for 30 years. And her brother took another non-family member and said, this is her sister or her mother. I forget what the devil they did. Or no, they said it was the adoptee. And they put notes in all of her files that if you ever find these, call us. And she just happened to find one of those files. She had been taken away when she was born, found them when she was in her 40s. And to talk to her, every other word, she would break down, and it was very difficult. The adoption agency told her she was an only child. She had 9 brothers and sisters. Told her she wasn't a Ojibwe, she was a Ojibwe. But and told her that her mother voluntarily gave her away when that wasn't the case, because the mother kept the other children and was stripped of this child. That's the trauma that sets off through the social services, not simply through international adoptions, but national adoptions. And I think it is an issue that goes well beyond being Indian.
We have a question here from Greater Minnesota. This is from the University of Minnesota Duluth site. They are asking, what are 3 things you really want future early childhood educators to take from this into their classroom?
Well, that's Karina's job.
The elder swung it this way. I would say probably the 3 major things for early childhood education probably is to really know and understand the process of what we know right now anyways around historical or intergenerational trauma and the impact on children and families. And probably for early childhood, I would say it's the more of the focus is more on the parenting and parenting issues related to child development and working closely with kids, and that helping parents begin to think about if there's an intervention that's needed, how they need to think about historical trauma or intergenerational trauma may be or may not be a part of that. Not everybody who has a history of historical trauma in their families or their communities have a historical trauma response. So I think it's really important to not just assume there's a bunch of pathology running around. I think that's the exception and not the rule. So I just want to put that out there. But there may be some stress vulnerability issues that the family need to be aware of, and just kind of be aware of that in any kind of parenting practices that you're working with families. So no historical trauma. More importantly, no pre-colonial history in working with the Indigenous communities you're working with, because our stories start not about the trauma. That's not where our story begins. Our story begins with our traditions and our original instructions and who we are as a people. So I would say that's the other piece, is to know the communities that you're really working with and get directly connected, if you aren't already, with the Indigenous communities that you're serving, and really work closely with them to help develop culturally relevant programming, language development, especially for young people where that's available. So that's off the top of my head. So, oh, she looks like she.
Hi. My question, well, just to preface this, I've done many home visits, and I've had quite a few Native families. Most families I do very, very well with. The Native families I didn't do so well with. I think it's the only group of families that I felt like there wasn't a connection. Usually I was assigned to those families because I wasn't the skinny white woman, and I was the closest to whatever could get in the door, I think. So, but once I was in the door, I noticed, I knew the grandma had to be acknowledged in some way and incorporated, even though she wasn't necessarily outwardly involved, just kind of, well, it's her house, I'm in her house. But I'm just wondering, as a provider coming in or a service to the family, what are things that would help me be in a better relationship with the elders? I mean, I was aware that there was a lot of things I couldn't ask of her or ask of their family per se to discuss, but I kind of felt like there's things I don't know about how to operate in their household, and I don't know if, I don't know, is there just some feedback you can give me about when you're entering their home? Because one of my big goals is how, when I enter someone's home, is it comfortable for them, I guess? And I put a lot of energy into the initial relationship part, because you really can't do anything else until they like you and feel comfortable with you.
I'm like Karina's great-grandmother. I don't want you in my home. No, all kidding aside, that's really really tough one because even in Minnesota, and when I say history is now, back in the 70s, I used to carry a 30-30 wherever I went because they had a hit list out in Cass Lake, and I was 8th or 9th on the hit list. I said, well, they're not going to catch me without anything. But really, I used to remember my dad protecting his children, and he wouldn't let anybody in the house. And I remember when a welfare worker came to my home one time, they didn't get in the door. You know, I just said, no, well, you just stay out there and we'll talk. I think Karina's generation is a little different in that, but we do find, I found it an imposition oftentimes. So I'm really not able to help you in that regard unless you team up with somebody. I did team up with a white guy for a while, and when I worked with my community, I would just go in the house and sit down and talk, and he'd say, no, you can't do that, you'll get sued. And I said, you know, if you carry that attitude, you're going to get in a lot of trouble because you're not going to help anybody. You know, you just got to, yeah, things are dicey sometimes, but you got to take the risk. We're paid to take the risk, I think. I didn't answer your question, I just sort of stonewalled. I'm sorry.
I think, yeah, part of the problem John's talking about is that the Indians, whenever they're interacting with our system, we have a pretty conflicted relationship with the social service system. And just because you want to come in, they're allowing you in, but they don't want you there. I think that you need to partner with somebody, and it's best if you can find somebody who is Native, but if it isn't, it just needs to be somebody who can sit down and visit. You can't go in there with an agenda. We can spot an agenda a mile away. And then we're just going to give you we're the best chameleons. We'll give you a little smile. Hi, yeah. And then when they leave that crazy lady, I'm never letting her in the door, you know. Yeah. Stop answering your phone calls, non-cooperative, non-compliant, knocking on the door. They're there, but they're not letting you in. That sort of thing. There won't be direct confrontation. You won't even know because we don't do direct confrontation. So basically, I think what you really need to do is you need to go in there and just visit and get to know them. You can't have an agenda. You can't ask them to do anything. If you come in there with a pile of papers for them to sign, you know, those sorts of things, I think if you start off that way, you'll get a little bit of compliance, but it's surface. You're not going to get anywhere. You just need to go in and drop in and visit and be yourself.
To capture a little of that behavior. John, what is the title of that book? No. The book on Always Say Yes or something?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, yes is better than no. It's a comical book, but it's a worthwhile read.
So I guess, is it, because every home usually that I entered, I was asked, are you Native in any way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That was like the first question.
That's how we introduce ourselves. That's how we know who you are. We always introduce ourselves. And my mom and dad are this. If I go back home, who's your parents?
But would that have made it okay? I mean, I continued to get into the homes. I think they actually felt sorry for me.
Probably.
that I had to do my
They wanted to be
job.
nice. Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I could get in and do home visits, and like you said, I was way over planned. I mean, I had one young lady mapped out to go to college and start in 3 weeks, and I mean, once I found out she had free money to go, I'm thinking, why aren't you going? And finally, I actually talked to an elderly woman, and she told me, no, education isn't even a piece you should even start talking about.
Yeah, that's too soon.
Yeah.
You just need to sit down and visit and start the connection. Bring them something, you know. I mean, I'm assuming they offered you something to drink or eat, maybe.
They stared at me for a little bit. I think they were trying to figure out what am I first. Sometimes I have to just define who I am before people.
Just tell them who you are and what your experience is.
Yeah.
You know, I think, you know, oftentimes where I get with people, we are probably the most resilient people. And one of the ways we've been resilient, but also has a little historical is humor.
Yeah.
We love to laugh. If you can kind of get them to laugh, you might get them to listen to you more. I mean, I'm sure you have some humorous stories that you'd be willing to possibly share from your culture. And I mean, people can, we relate. We might be different, but we're all connected. We're all relatives.
Well, this particular family, once I told her what Native American tribe I thought I was,
Okay.
that made them laugh because they were like, no.
Yeah.
So that was,
Yeah,
that was kind of a, but that was told to me by my grandmother. So if I was wrong, she was wrong.
If they start teasing you,
Yeah,
then
it's a good
it's
sign.
a good sign.
If they start teasing you, it's
yeah.
good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We only tease you if we love you.
Yeah. I would just add, you know, if it's one thing if it's a isolated family in a urban setting versus a rural reservation-based type of community. If it's that kind of a community where you are starting to pick up caseloads, I think it's really helpful for you to get connected with whatever workers are there and elders. There's elders groups and tribes.
Yeah.
And you go to a luncheon, go to an elders meeting, ask permission to introduce yourself, and just say, listen, this is who I am. I'm, you know, fumbling and I'm finding my way here. What can I do to best provide the best services for your community and your people? And just, you know, visit. No other agenda than that, just to introduce yourself so you're a familiar face to the community and they start to get to know you and people stare at you and they'll try to figure out and, you know, in about a year everything will be a little bit better.
Yeah.
But there's an opportunity that a lot of people don't take, you know, to actually go meet with elders. That's not on your caseload, but go to meet a community and say, you know, I'm trying to do whatever I can to be of assistance and I'm learning.
You need to be visible in our community.
Yeah.
If you're not visible, we don't know if we can trust you. And what I mean by that is we have a lot of, like you've discussed, a lot of loss. And I always say, are you going to be here for a while? Because if you're not going to be here for a while, I'm not going to get attached to you because it's too painful. Because it triggers lots of other losses. So it's really just being visible. And I mean, a lot of the people who've gotten adopted into our community, so to speak, informally, because they've just worked with us so long, have been visible and they've gone to events, they've spoken with elders, they come to our powwows or our other ceremonies that we throw for our families. And they look forward to seeing them. You know, and it took several years for that.
And people know if you're there to, you know, in general to help or if you're there to become Indian, that's not the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, and communities read that a mile away. Mm-hmm. And so when you're there to just be of whatever support you can to the community and volunteer and just be there for, you know, if you end up in the kitchen, it's a good sign.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah. So there's one woman that became part of ceremonies that I go to, and she's a white lady. And she has no desire whatsoever to be Native. And she honestly came to just help cook or whatever we needed done. And, you know, the elder there kind of adopted her because she saw the goodness in her heart and saw that she understood who she was. And that was really important. So knowing who you are and having a good self-deprecating sense of humor and willing to be humbled a few times, you'll be great. You'll be golden.
Yeah.
Over time.
I know there are more people who want to.
A lot of that applies to us as well.
Yeah.
Where
Exactly.
when I go home, all the years that I've been a PhD don't mean a thing.
Don't say
You know, I'm sweeping the floor,
hired.
serving coffee.
My
know there
grandma
are
would say,
more.
I told you going to that Native, that school would ruin you. Get over here.
Yeah.
Okay. Palmer. What's that?
We're going to tell stories now, eh?
I know there are more questions and more things to be said, but unfortunately our time is up. I want to thank you all. Please remember to hand in your evaluations as you leave and pick up your certificates of attendance. And our panelists, I'm sure, will be around for a few more minutes to chat with folks, but thank you so much.